Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, my dear friend. Tonight we're setting off on a slow, gentle journey through 10 royal unions that did far more than just join two hearts. They reshaped lands, stirred revolutions, and changed the direction of history forever. We begin with a story that starts with fake papers, a secret ceremony in the dark of night, and a nervous 18-year-old princess who would go on to help forge one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. This is the marriage that gave birth to Spain itself. Before we step into this amazing story together, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up only if you truly enjoy what we're exploring tonight. I pour my whole heart into researching these tales, and your support means more than I can say. I'm also curious, where are you listening from right now? Are you cozy in bed somewhere in Texas, unwinding after a long day in California? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the world? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Now, go ahead and dim the lights, get nice and comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum. And let's travel back to the year 1469, to a time when kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of a single wedding vow. Picture this. It's October 18th, 1469. In a modest palace in Valladolid, Spain, a young woman named Isabella stands before a mirror. She's 18 years old, and tomorrow she's about to do something that many would call treason. Tomorrow she'll marry Ferdinand of Aragon in secret, against the clear wishes of her half-brother, the King of Castile, and the special permission from the Pope that would allow this marriage between second cousins. It's a fake completely made up. But let's step back, because to understand why Isabella would risk everything for this union, we need to see just how broken Spain was at this moment in time. The Spain we know today didn't exist. Instead, the Iberian Peninsula was a messy patchwork of rival kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Granada. For centuries, these lands had fought each other, made alliances, broke them and fought again. It was exhausting, it was chaotic, and for the ordinary people living through it, it must have felt like the fighting would never stop. Isabella grew up in this world of uncertainty. Her father, John II of Castile, died when she was only 3 years old. Her half-brother, Henry IV, became king. And let's just say Henry wasn't exactly known for being a strong or decisive leader. His court was packed with ambitious nobles who twisted him around their fingers. His marriage produced a daughter whose real father was openly questioned. They even called her Juana la Beltranja, hinting that she was the daughter of Henry's favorite, Beltran de la Cueva, not Henry himself. It was a mess. A real mess. Isabella had been named heir to the throne at age 13 through the Treaty of the Bulls of Gisando in 1468, but it was a shaky. She knew that to secure her claim, to have any real hope of ruling Castile, she needed a powerful ally. She needed a husband who could bring military strength, political know-how, and legitimacy. Enter Ferdinand. Ferdinand of Aragon was 17 years old, a year younger than Isabella. But don't let his age fool you. This young man had already proven himself on the battlefield, fighting beside his father, John II of Aragon, during their civil wars. He was charming, smart, and deeply ambitious. His kingdom of Aragon, which included Catalonia, Valencia, and some powerful Mediterranean territories, was wealthy and strong. He was exactly what Isabella needed. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. First, Isabella and Ferdinand were second cousins, both descended from John I of Castile. The Catholic Church required a special papal permission for such close relatives to marry. Second, King Henry IV of Castile absolutely did not want this marriage to happen. Had his own plans for Isabella, plans that involved marrying her off to someone he could control. Third, the Pope at the time, Paul II, was firmly against Aragon's growing power in the Mediterranean and refused to grant the permission. So what did they do? They faked it. Some historians still argue over whether it was Alfonso Carrillo de Acuña, the Archbishop of Toledo, or another conspirator created a forged papal document claiming that Pope Pius II, who had died 6 years earlier, had granted the permission. It was bold. It was risky. It could have gotten them excommunicated, but it worked. The wedding took place on October 19, 1469, at the Palace of Los Vivero in Valladolid. It was a quiet affair by royal standards. They couldn't risk drawing too much attention. Isabella wore a gown that had to be borrowed because they didn't have enough money for a proper royal wedding dress. Ferdinand's father sent 6,000 florins to help pay for the ceremony, but even that wasn't enough for the kind of grand event people expected. The jewels Isabella wore were also borrowed. This was a marriage built on hope, determination, and a whole lot of debt. But here's what makes this moment so remarkable. When they exchanged their vows, Isabella and Ferdinand also exchanged something else: power. They created what historians call a dual monarchy. The motto they adopted said it perfectly. Tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, which roughly translates to they are the same, Isabella as Ferdinand, or one is equal to the other. This was revolutionary. In a world where women, even queens, were expected to defer to their husbands, Isabella insisted on equality. She would rule Castile, he would rule Aragon, and together they would make decisions for both kingdoms. Now, you might think that after the wedding, everything would be smooth sailing. Not even close. King Henry IV was furious. He immediately revoked Isabella's status as heir and declared that Juana left. Beltranja was the rightful successor. When Henry died in 1474, Isabella quickly proclaimed herself Queen of Castile. But Juana and her supporters, backed by the King of Portugal, Afonso V, were not about to give up without a fight. This sparked the War of the Castilian Succession, which lasted from 1475 to 1479. It was brutal. Portugal invaded, backing Juana's claim. Castilian nobles chose sides, splitting the kingdom. Isabella and Ferdinand found themselves fighting for their very survival. But here's where their partnership truly shone. Isabella handled the political side, rallying nobles, securing funds, keeping supply lines open. Ferdinand led the armies in the field. They were, in every sense, a team, and they were brilliant at shaping public opinion. Even when battles ended in stalemates, they portrayed them as stunning victories. They presented themselves as the new generation of leadership, contrasting their youth and energy with the old, corrupt regime. They offered amnesty to nobles who abandoned Juana's cause while dealing harshly with those who refused. By 1476, the tide had turned in their favor. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Alcasovas in 1479. Portugal recognized Isabella as the rightful Queen of Castile. Juana la Beltranja was sent to a monastery, where she would spend the rest of her life. The treaty also set spheres of influence for future exploration. Portugal got rights to the African coast and the Atlantic islands, while Castile got the Canary Islands. This seemingly small detail would become hugely important just 13 years later, when a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus came looking for funding. But winning the war was only the beginning. Isabella and Ferdinand now faced the challenge of actually unifying their kingdoms. Remember, they weren't creating a fully merged nation. Castile and Aragon remained legally separate, with their own laws, their own coins, their own parliaments. What Isabella and Ferdinand created was more like a confederation held together by their marriage and their joint rule. In 1481, Ferdinand granted Isabella all the same rights in Aragon that she had given him in Castile. They combined their coats of arms into a single emblem featuring the symbols of both kingdoms. They were building something new, and then they set their sights on Granada. The Emirate of Granada was the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia left over from the Moorish conquest that had begun way back in 711. For 780 years, Muslim rulers had controlled parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Granada was wealthy, sophisticated, and well defended, nestled in the mountains of southern Spain. Many had tried to conquer it. All had failed. In 1482, Ferdinand and Isabella launched what they called the Granada War. It would take 10 years of sieges, battles, negotiations, and setbacks. They brought together the latest military technology, gunpowder artillery that could smash through medieval fortifications. They secured funding from the Pope, who declared it a crusade, which meant they could collect special taxes. Isabella personally managed the logistics, ensuring that the armies were fed, supplied, and paid. She even sold her own jewelry to raise funds. The campaign was methodical. They didn't try to take Granada in one massive assault. Instead, they conquered the smaller cities and towns around it, one by one, slowly strangling the emirate. Ronda fell in 1485, Malaga in 1487. By 1491, Granada was isolated and running out of options. On January 2, 1492, the last Moorish king, Mohammed XII, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, rode out of the Alhambra palace and handed the keys to Ferdinand and Isabella. Legend says that as he left Granada for the last time, he looked back at the city and wept. His mother, Akessa, supposedly told him, "You do well to weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Whether or not this actually happened, it captures the enormity of the moment. After 780 years, Muslim rule in Iberia had ended. The Reconquista was complete. Remember that year because it wasn't just about Granada. In that single year, Ferdinand and Isabella made 3 decisions that would change the world. First, they completed the conquest of Granada, unifying most of the Iberian Peninsula under Christian rule. Second, they issued the Alhambra Decree, which gave the Jewish population of Spain 4 months to either convert to Catholicism or leave the country. Tens of thousands of Jews fled to Portugal, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere. It was a tragedy that would haunt Spain for centuries, stripping the country of some of its most educated, skilled, and prosperous citizens. And third, and this is where everything gets even bigger, they decided to fund a persistent Genoese sailor who had been trying for years to get sponsorship for a wild idea. His name was Christopher Columbus. He wanted to sail west to reach the Indies, convinced the world was smaller then. Everyone thought. Isabella, fresh from victory in Granada, had the confidence and the funds to take a risk. She agreed to sponsor his voyage. We all know what happened next. Columbus didn't reach the Indies. He stumbled onto an entirely different landmass, the Americas. The consequences of this discovery would be enormous. Spain would build an empire that stretched from California to Patagonia, from the Philippines to the Netherlands. They would bring back gold and silver that flooded European markets, changing the global economy. They would spread Spanish language, culture, and Catholicism across vast territories. But they would also bring disease, conquest, and suffering to indigenous peoples on a scale that's hard to comprehend. The Columbian exchanged the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New fundamentally altered both hemispheres forever. And it all traced back to that wedding in 1469, when an 18-year-old princess and a 17-year-old prince decided to forge papal documents and bet everything on each other. But their personal story didn't have a fairy tale ending. Isabella and Ferdinand had 5 children, and they used them strategically, arranging marriages that would strengthen Spain's position in Europe. Their eldest daughter, Isabella, married Manuel I of Portugal twice, first to his son John, and after John's death to Manuel himself. Another daughter, Juana, married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, which would eventually lead to their grandson Charles becoming Holy Roman Emperor and ruling over a vast European empire. Their daughter Catherine, you might know her as Catherine of Aragon, married Arthur, Prince of Wales, and after his death, his brother Henry VIII of England. That marriage would eventually lead to England's break with Rome, but that's a story for another time. Their only son, Juan, the heir they had hoped would inherit everything, died suddenly in 1497 at age 19, just months. After his wedding, Isabella was devastated. Then their daughter Isabella died in childbirth in 1498 along with her infant son. Their daughter Maria became Queen of Portugal. But it was Juana who would inherit Castile, and Juana was showing signs of serious mental instability. History remembers her as Juana la Loca Joana the Mad. Isabella of Castile died on November 26, 1504, at the age of 53. She had ruled for 30 years, transformed a fractured kingdom into a unified power, completed the Reconquista, launched an age of exploration, and established Spain as a dominant force in Europe. But her death marked the end of the partnership that had made it all possible. Ferdinand remarried, trying to produce another heir, but it didn't work out. The succession passed to Juana and Philip, and eventually to their son Charles, who became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruling over an empire where, as they said, the sun never set. So, what's the lesson here? What can we take away from this extraordinary story? I think it's this. A single strategic marriage, built on partnership and equality, can literally create a nation, but it comes with costs. The unification of Spain brought stability and power, yes, but it also brought religious intolerance, the trauma of the Inquisition, the exploitation of indigenous peoples in the Americas. Isabella and Ferdinand's marriage created a superpower, but superpowers cast long shadows, and there's something else. That forged papal document they used to get married at worked. They got away with it. Eventually, Pope Alexander VI legitimized their marriage and even gave them the title the Catholic monarchs in 1496. Sometimes in history, audacity pays off. Sometimes breaking the rules creates something entirely new. That doesn't make it right, necessarily, but it does make it fascinating. Now, as you settle deeper into your pillows tonight, I want you to think about Isabella at 18 years old, making the choice to defy her king. And marry in secret, the courage that took, the vision, the partnership she and Ferdinand built, treating each other as equals in an age when that was almost unheard of, and how that single decision in 1469 rippled outward across centuries, shaping the world we live in today. Next, we're going to explore a marriage strategy that went terribly, tragically wrong. We're heading north to the Habsburg dynasty, where the motto was, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." Yes, the Habsburgs conquered half of Europe through weddings instead of battles. It was brilliant, it was effective, until it destroyed them from within. Stay with me as we uncover how the most powerful family in Europe became the victim of their own success, and how the infamous Habsburg jaw became a symbol of what happens when royals marry too close to home. The next chapter in our journey through history's most consequential marriages is just ahead. There's a Latin motto that once echoed through the marble halls of Vienna: Bella gerent alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. For the Habsburg dynasty, this wasn't just a clever saying, it was their entire foreign policy. While other kingdoms bled their treasuries dry on battlefields, the Habsburgs conquered half of Europe, one wedding at a time. Burgundy married into it. Spain, a wedding gift. Hungary and Bohemia. You guessed it, marriage alliances. It was brilliant. It was the most successful dynasty-building strategy in European history until it became their undoing. Because here's the thing about marrying your way to an empire. Eventually, you run out of suitable partners outside the family. And when you're obsessed with keeping power within the bloodline, when you start viewing cousins as the ideal match, when uncles marry nieces and brothers marry sisters-in-law, genetics doesn't just knock on the door, it kicks it down. Welcome to the story of how the most powerful family in the world destroyed itself one wedding at a time. Let's start with the architect of this whole strategy, Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled from 1493 to 1519. Now, Maximilian understood something that most rulers of his era didn't. Wars are expensive, unpredictable, and even when you win, you often lose more than you gain. But a wedding? A wedding is an investment that keeps paying dividends for generations. So Maximilian became essentially the most successful matchmaker in history. His own marriage set the template. In 1477, he married Mary of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. Through this single marriage, the Habsburgs gained control of the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, along with parts of France. These were some of the richest territories in Europe, filled with prosperous trading cities. One wedding, and suddenly the Habsburgs were major players. But Maximilian didn't stop there. He looked at the political landscape of Europe like a chessboard, and he started arranging marriages decades in advance. His son Philip, nicknamed the Handsome, and apparently he really was quite good-looking, was married to Joanna of Castile in 1496. Remember Joanna from our last story? The daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. This marriage would eventually unite the Spanish and Habsburg thrones under one ruler, creating an empire that stretched from Peru to the Philippines. To secure his eastern borders, Maximilian arranged for his grandchildren to marry into the royal families of Hungary and Bohemia. These strategic alliances meant that when the kings of Hungary and Bohemia died at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, fighting the Ottomans, the Habsburg family inherited both kingdoms without firing a single shot. It was the ultimate hostile takeover, medieval style. And here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean genetically problematic. The Habsburgs were so successful with this marriage strategy that other royal families wanted to ally with them. But the Habsburgs, flushed with success, started to think, why share power with outsiders when we can keep it in the family? So they started marrying each other. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The family tree started to look less like a tree and more like a tangled vine. Now, I want you to imagine you're a Habsburg royal in the 1500s. You're surrounded by wealth, power, and luxury beyond imagination. You own palaces across Europe. Your family rules over territories where the sun literally never sets. You're descended from emperors going back centuries. And when it's time for you to marry, your parents present you with a portrait of your first cousin. Perfect match, they say. Keeps the bloodline pure, keeps the inheritance intact, keeps power in the family. And you, having been raised in this world, think this is completely normal. This was the reality for generations of Habsburgs. Philip II of Spain, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, married 4 times. His last wife, Anna of Austria, was his niece, his own brother's daughter. And this wasn't scandalous. It required a papal dispensation, sure, but the Pope granted it because this is what powerful families did. The Church frowned on it publicly but approved it privately for the right price and political advantage. Let me paint you a picture of what was happening genetically. Every human being has 2 copies of each gene, one from mom, one from dad. When parents are unrelated, those genes are different, which generally means that if one copy has a problem, the other can compensate. But when parents are closely related, they share many of the same genes, including the problematic ones. When both parents pass on the same faulty gene, there's no backup. The problems compound. Generation after generation, the Habsburg gene pool got smaller and smaller, and you could literally see it in their faces. Have you ever looked at Habsburg portraits? If you haven't, look them up. After this, it's striking. There's a pronounced jawline that became known as the Habsburg jaw or mandibular prognathism to be technical. The lower jaw protrudes forward, making it difficult to chew food properly. Some Habsburg rulers couldn't close their mouths fully. Eating became a challenge. Speaking clearly was difficult, but it wasn't just the jaw. There were other issues. The Habsburg lip, a thick, drooping lower lip and a distinctive nose. And these were just the visible problems. Behind the scenes, there were fertility issues, high infant mortality, developmental delays, and chronic health problems. The family that had conquered Europe through strategic marriages was slowly being conquered by their own DNA. Now let's talk about the most tragic example of this entire saga. Charles II of Spain, who was born in 1661 and became king at age 4 when his father, Philip IV, died. Charles is often called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because people at the time couldn't understand what was wrong with him. They thought he must be cursed. In reality, he was the product of generations of inbreeding so severe that his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. Think about that. His actual parents were uncle and niece, but genetically speaking, it was worse than brother-sister incest. Charles couldn't walk until he was 8 years old. He couldn't speak clearly. His tongue was too large for his mouth, and that Habsburg jaw made articulation nearly impossible. He drooled constantly. He had frequent seizures. His body was weak, his mind limited, and ruling an empire was absolutely beyond his capabilities. Court documents describe him as having a head full of water and being unable to chew his food. Servants had to partially digest it for him first. Can you imagine the most powerful empire on earth ruled by a king who couldn't feed himself? But here's the real tragedy, and this is what ultimately brought down the Spanish Habsburg line. Charles was completely sterile. He married twice, desperately trying to produce an heir, but it was biologically impossible. When he died in 1700 at age 38, after decades of suffering, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him. No sons, no daughters, no direct heirs at all. And this sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714. France, Austria, Britain, the Netherlands, basically every major European power went to war over who would inherit the Spanish throne and its vast empire. Hundreds of thousands of people died. The map of Europe was redrawn, all because the Habsburgs had spent 2 centuries marrying their cousins to keep power in the family, and it had literally bred them into extinction. Scientists have actually studied this. In 2009, researchers analyzed 15 generations of the Spanish Habsburg family tree. They calculated something called the inbreeding coefficient for each family member, basically, a number that tells you how genetically similar someone's parents were. For a completely unrelated couple, this number is 0. For Charles II, it was 0.254. That's higher than the expected value for children born to a brother-sister pairing. His parents were related to each other in at least 7 different ways through their ancestry. The study concluded that the Habsburg dynasty's extinction was directly caused by inbreeding. It wasn't bad luck, it wasn't God's will. It was genetics, plain and simple. The very strategy that had built the empire's strategic marriages within an increasingly narrow pool of partners had destroyed it. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but this was just the Spanish Habsburgs, right? Surely the Austrian branch was smarter. Well, not exactly. The Austrian Habsburgs continued on, but they carried many of the same genetic problems. They just got slightly luckier with their marriages in later generations, occasionally bringing in fresh blood from other dynasties. But here's something really fascinating. The Habsburg story isn't unique. We see this pattern repeat throughout royal history. Remember Queen Victoria from the British royal family? She was a carrier of haemophilia, a genetic blood disorder that prevents proper clotting. This gene is carried on the X chromosome, which means women can be carriers without showing symptoms. But when they pass it to their sons, those sons suffer from the disease. Victoria had 9 children and married them off to royal families across Europe, spreading the haemophilia gene like wildfire through European royalty. Her daughter Alice married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and their daughter Alex married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Alexandra and Nicholas's son, Alexei the heir to the Russian throne, had haemophilia. The disease was so severe that the royal family became desperate for any treatment, which is how the mystic Rasputin gained such influence over them. Many historians argue that the haemophilia crisis contributed to the fall of the Romanov dynasty and the Russian Revolution. One genetic mutation spread through strategic royal marriages, helping to topple an empire. Or consider the Ptolemaic dynasty in ancient Egypt. Cleopatra was the product of over 2 centuries of brother-sister marriages. The Ptolemies, who were actually Greek, not Egyptian, believed that marrying within the family kept the royal bloodline pure and prevented rival families from claiming the throne. Cleopatra herself was married to two of her younger brothers, as was the custom. The genetic problems in that family line were so severe that when the dynasty ended with Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, many historians breathed a sigh of relief on behalf of the gene pool. So what's the lesson here? Why am I telling you this story as you drift off to sleep? Because this is a perfect example of how short-term success can lead to long-term catastrophe. The Habsburgs' marriage strategy was brilliant for about a century. It built one of the most powerful empires in human history. But they didn't know when to stop. They didn't understand genetics. Nobody did back then. They confused keeping power with keeping bloodlines pure, and they paid the ultimate price. There's also something deeply human about this story. These weren't evil people. They were working with the knowledge and values of their time. They genuinely believed that royal blood was special, that mixing it with commoners would somehow dilute their divine right to rule. They thought they were doing the right thing, preserving their family's legacy. And in a tragic irony, their efforts to preserve that legacy destroyed it. And here's something else to consider as you settle into sleep tonight. We're not actually that far removed from this way of thinking. Even today, we see families not royal ones, but wealthy and powerful ones trying to keep fortunes in the family through strategic marriages and closed. We see communities that discourage marriage outside the group. We see the same impulse to protect what we have by keeping it exclusive. The Habsburgs just took it to a logical extreme, and we can see clearly now how that turned out. The Habsburg jaw became a symbol, a warning written in bone and flesh. It appeared in countless portraits, documented by the best artists of the age. If you look at paintings of Charles V, who ruled from 1519 to 1556, you can see the jaw is already prominent. By the time you get to Charles II, over a century later, the jaw dominates the face. It's like watching a genetic time bomb in slow motion, captured in oil and canvas. You know what's really haunting? The Habsburg family had the best doctors in Europe. They had access to all the medical knowledge of their time, but nobody understood what was happening. They could see their children were sick, weak, dying young, but they couldn't connect it to the marriage patterns. They blamed everything else. Bad air, divine punishment, witchcraft, the alignment of the planets. Charles II had exorcisms performed on him. They thought he was possessed by demons. In reality, he was possessed by his own family tree. The story of the Habsburgs reminds us that nature doesn't care about empires. Genetics doesn't respect crowns. You can own half the world, but if you ignore biological reality, reality will eventually win. The Habsburgs learned this lesson, but by the time they understood it, it was too late. The Spanish line was extinct. The Austrian line was permanently marked by their genetic legacy. And yet, here's the thing. Some Habsburg descendants are still around today. The Austrian line continued, eventually ending their inbreeding practices and marrying into other families. The Habsburg jaw gradually faded from the family. The genetic diversity that they had tried so hard to avoid that they saw as contamination turned out to be exactly what they needed to survive. Isn't that ironic? The very thing they feared would weaken them was the thing that could have saved them. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think about this. Sometimes the strategies that bring us success in the short term can carry the seeds of our destruction. The Habsburgs mastered the art of the strategic marriage. They built an empire through weddings instead of wars. But they couldn't adapt when the world changed, when their strategy stopped working. And that inability to change, that rigid adherence to this, is how we've always done it, cost them everything. But our journey through history's most consequential marriages isn't over. In fact, we're about to encounter a marriage that was supposed to do exactly what the Habsburg marriages tried to do. Create peace, build alliances, unite nations. But instead of failing slowly over generations like the Habsburgs, this marriage failed spectacularly, publicly and tragically in a single lifetime. We're heading to France now, to the Palace of, where a 14-year-old Austrian princess is about to marry the future king of France. Her name is Marie Antoinette, and her wedding was meant to seal an alliance between two former enemies. Instead, it would help spark a revolution that would change the world forever. The next chapter in our story is just ahead, so stay with me as we explore the marriage that was meant to save a monarchy but ended on the guillotine. Imagine being 14 years old and being told you're going to save your country, not through battle or diplomacy that you control, but simply by existing in a foreign land, married to a boy you've never met, serving as a living symbol of peace between two nations that have hated each other for 300 years. That was Marie Antoinette's job description. And from the very first day, almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The year is 1770. Europe is still recovering from the 7 Years' War, a brutal conflict that redrew maps and emptied treasuries. France and Austria, longtime enemies, have decided to try something radical, an alliance. And to seal this deal, to make it feel permanent and binding, they're going to marry off Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, the 15th child of Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, to Louis Auguste, the awkward teenage grandson of France's King Louis XV. The girl will become Marie Antoinette, the boy will become Louis XVI, and their marriage will become one of history's most spectacular failures. But let's start at the beginning, because the story of how this marriage fell apart actually starts before the wedding even happens. Marie Antoinette, let's call her that from now on, even though she was still Maria Antonia at this point, was born on November 2nd, 1755, in Vienna. She was the youngest daughter of one of the most powerful women in Europe, Empress Maria Theresa, who ruled the Habsburg domains with an iron will. You'd think being born into such power would mean a careful education, preparation for the political role she'd play.
Not quite.
Marie Antoinette's education was, to put it mildly, lacking. While her brothers studied languages, mathematics, history, and politics, Marie Antoinette learned to dance, to carry herself gracefully, and to look pretty. She could barely write in German, her native language. Her French was atrocious. When the marriage was first proposed, her future French tutor was horrified at how little she knew. One observer wrote that she was more intelligent than has been generally supposed, but since she's rather lazy and extremely frivolous, she's hard to teach. This 14-year-old girl, who could barely string together a proper sentence in French, was about to become the Dauphine of France II, only to the Queen in the most sophisticated court in Europe. The wedding preparations were elaborate and strange. First, Marie Antoinette had to be symbolically stripped of everything Austrian, and I mean everything. On the border between Austria and France, on a small island in the Rhine River, they built a special wooden pavilion. On one side, the door opened to Austria. On the other side, to France. Marie Antoinette entered from the Austrian side, accompanied by her Austrian attendants. Inside the pavilion, she was completely undressed. And when I say completely, I mean they took away every stitch of clothing, every piece of jewelry, even her undergarments. Everything Austrian had to go. Then she was redressed in entirely French clothing, with French ladies in waiting. She walked out the French door as a different person. Symbolically, Maria Antonia of Austria had died. Marie Antoinette of France had been born. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? You're 14 years old, in a wooden building in the middle of nowhere, being stripped naked by strangers, knowing you'll never see your mother again, never return to your home, never speak your native language in public. You're being erased and remade. And everyone's telling you this is an honor. The actual wedding took place on May 16, 1770, in the Royal Chapel at Versailles. It was magnificent. Hundreds of nobles, elaborate costumes, a feast that lasted for hours. Marie Antoinette wore a dress so heavy with silver embroidery and diamonds that she could barely move. Louis Auguste, her new husband, was 15 years old, overweight, awkward, and terrified of social situations. He loved locksmithing and hunting. She loved dancing and fashion. They had absolutely nothing in common. But here's where things get really uncomfortable, and I apologize because we need to talk about this to understand why this marriage was doomed from the start. Royal marriages were expected to be consummated immediately. It was considered proof that the marriage was valid and that heirs would be forthcoming. On the wedding night, there was actually a ceremony where the couple was led to the bedroom. The bed was blessed by the Archbishop of Reims and members of the court watched as they got into bed together. This wasn't considered weird. This was normal for royal weddings. You needed witnesses to confirm the marriage was real, but nothing happened. Not that night, not the next night, not for 7 years. 7 years, and this wasn't a secret. Everyone knew. It was a national scandal. Pamphlets circulated mocking the young couple's inability to produce an heir. Political enemies whispered that perhaps Marie Antoinette was barren or worse, that she was having affairs to compensate for her husband's inadequacy. The pressure on both of them must have been absolutely crushing. So what was the problem? Historians have debated this for centuries, and we still don't have a definitive answer. Some accounts suggest Louis had a minor physical condition called phimosis that made intercourse painful, though he apparently refused to have the simple surgical procedure that would have fixed it. Other historians think the problem was purely psychological. Louis was shy, awkward, completely unprepared for intimacy, and under so much pressure that he simply couldn't perform. Marie Antoinette, for her part, was equally clueless. Neither of them had received any kind of education about sex, which was considered improper for royal children. The situation got so desperate that in 1777, Empress Maria Theresa sent Marie Antoinette's brother, Emperor Joseph II, to France essentially to serve as a marriage counselor. Can you imagine how awkward that conversation must have been? Joseph actually wrote detailed letters back to his mother about the situation, and these letters still exist. He wrote that Marie Antoinette and Louis were two complete blunderers, and that Louis admitted to him that he would introduce the member for about 2 minutes and then withdraw without finishing. Joseph apparently gave Louis some very direct advice about the mechanics of the situation. Whatever Joseph said, it worked. 8 months later, Marie Antoinette became pregnant. In 1778, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. 3 years later, she had a son, Louis-Joseph. Then another son, Louis-Charles, and finally another daughter, Sophie. Though Sophie died in infancy, Marie Antoinette loved her children desperately. But by the time she was finally producing heirs, her reputation was already destroyed. Because here's what had happened during those 7 childless years. Marie Antoinette had become intensely unpopular. The French people had initially been charmed by her. She was young, beautiful, graceful. Her first public appearance in Paris in 1773 was a triumph. Crowds cheered for her. But that goodwill evaporated quickly for several reasons. First, she was Austrian. France and Austria had been enemies for so long that many French people simply couldn't accept the alliance. They called her L'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, but it was a play on words that also sounded like Lotte Chien, which means the other bitch. Right from the very beginning, there was a xenophobic undercurrent to the criticism of her. Second, she was young and frivolous at a time when France was facing serious economic problems. While ordinary French people struggled with bread shortages and rising taxes, Marie Antoinette was throwing elaborate parties, gambling huge sums of money, and spending fortunes on clothes and jewelry. The contrast was stark, and it was cruel. Was she actually spending as much as people claimed? Probably not. Later accounting showed that her expenditures were significant but not catastrophic. But perception matters more than reality in politics, and the perception was that she was bleeding France dry. Third, she made political enemies. Remember, Marie Antoinette's whole purpose was to strengthen the Franco-Austrian alliance. So when political decisions needed to be made, she naturally advocated for Austria's interests. To French courtiers and politicians, this looked like foreign. She was seen as an Austrian spy in the heart of France, manipulating her weak husband to benefit her homeland. The reality was more complex. She actually struggled to have much political influence, and her brother Joseph was frequently disappointed at her inability to sway French policy. But again, perception mattered more than reality. And then came the affair of the diamond necklace in 1785, which destroyed what little was left of her reputation. This scandal is so bizarre that if I told you it was fiction, you'd say it was too far-fetched to be believable. But it's absolutely true, and it shows how completely Marie Antoinette had lost control of her public image. Here's what happened. There was a cardinal named Louis-René Édouard de Rohan, who desperately wanted to regain favor at court. He'd fallen out with Marie Antoinette years earlier, and she refused to speak to him. A con artist named Jean de Valois-Saint-Trémy, who claimed to be descended from French royalty, approached the cardinal with an incredible story. She told him that Marie Antoinette secretly wanted to buy an outrageously expensive diamond necklace, talking about something worth approximately $1.6 million in today's money, but couldn't ask the king directly because she'd already spent so much on jewelry. Jean said that if the cardinal would acquire the necklace on credit and give it to the queen would be so grateful that she'd forgive him and restore him to favor. The cardinal, desperate and apparently not very bright, believed this story. Jean even arranged a nighttime meeting in the gardens of Versailles, where the cardinal met a prostitute dressed up as Marie Antoinette, who whispered a few kind words to him. That was enough. He purchased the necklace on credit, handed it over to Jean, and waited for his reward. Of course, Jean immediately broke up the necklace and sold the diamonds. When the jewelers came demanding payment, the whole scheme unraveled. Marie Antoinette was completely innocent. She'd never asked for the necklace, never met with the cardinal, didn't even know about the scheme until it was exposed. But the public didn't believe her. They thought she'd orchestrated the whole thing and was lying to avoid paying for the necklace. The trial was a sensation, and although Marie Antoinette was cleared, her reputation was ruined. People were ready to believe the worst of her, and nothing she could say or do would change their minds. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Marie Antoinette had become a symbol of everything people hated about the monarchy. She was foreign. She was extravagant. She was out of touch. There's that famous quote attributed to her, "Let them eat cake," when told that the people had no bread. She never said that. It's a complete fabrication, probably invented decades before she was even born. But people believed she said it because it confirmed what they already thought about her. When Revolution began. Marie Antoinette finally showed some real political courage. While Louis XVI wavered and hesitated, unsure how to respond to the crisis, Marie Antoinette was decisive. She wrote secret letters to Austria and other monarchies, begging them to intervene to save the French crown. She tried to organize the royal family's escape. In June 1791, they attempted to flee France, heading for the Austrian Netherlands, where they hoped to find safety and organize a counter-revolutionary force. They almost made it. The flight to Varennes is one of those historical episodes where everything went wrong in the most absurd ways possible. The royal family was traveling in disguise, but Louis was recognized in a small town called Varennes. How? Because his face was on the money. Someone literally compared him to a coin and raised the alarm. They were captured, brought back to Paris, and from that moment they were essentially prisoners. The marriage that was supposed to cement an alliance between France and Austria had become a liability to both countries. Austria didn't want to be too closely associated with the increasingly hated French monarchy. France blamed Marie Antoinette for trying to bring foreign armies to invade their country. She was trapped, isolated, watching her children suffer in captivity, knowing that her husband was too weak to save them. In September 1792, the monarchy was officially abolished. France became a republic. Louis was tried for treason and executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793. Marie Antoinette was allowed to live for 9 more months, held in increasingly harsh conditions. Her son was taken from her and handed over to a cobbler who was supposed to re-educate him. She was denied news of her children. She became ill, probably with uterine cancer. And then, in October 1793, she was put on trial. The charges against her were absurd and vicious. She was accused of conspiring with Austria, of depleting the treasury, of organizing orgies. And then they went further. They accused her of sexually abusing her own son. It was a lie, a disgusting invention designed to make her seem monstrous. When her lawyer asked her to respond to this charge, she stood up with dignity and said, "I appeal to all mothers here present. Is such a crime possible?" Even the crowd in the courtroom, which had been hostile, fell silent. Everyone knew it was a lie, but she was convicted anyway. On October 16, 1793, at 37 years old, Marie Antoinette was taken to the guillotine. Unlike Louis, who'd been allowed to ride in a carriage, she was forced to ride in an open cart through jeering crowds. Her hands were tied behind her back. Her hair had been chopped off. She wore a plain white dress. An artist named Jacques-Louis David sketched her in that cart, and the image is haunting. She looks old, exhausted, utterly defeated. She climbed the steps to the scaffold, accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and her last words were reportedly, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Even at the end, she was concerned with etiquette. The blade fell, and the marriage that was supposed to bring peace ended in blood. So what went wrong? How did a marriage designed to unite 2 nations end so catastrophically? I think there are several lessons here. First, you cannot use a marriage to paper over fundamental political and economic problems. France wasn't in crisis because it lacked an alliance with Austria. France was in crisis because of massive debt, an unfair tax system, food shortages, and a government structure that gave too much power to the nobility and too little to everyone else. Marie Antoinette's marriage didn't cause these problems, and it certainly couldn't solve them, but she became the scapegoat for all of it. Second, foreign-born queens are always vulnerable. Marie Antoinette never stopped being seen as Austrian, no matter how long she lived in France, no matter how many French children. She bore, in times of crisis, xenophobia is easy to exploit, and Marie Antoinette was an easy target. She was different. She was foreign, therefore she must be the enemy. Third, and maybe most important, a political marriage only works if both parties understand it's a partnership requiring real work, communication, and mutual support. Louis and Marie Antoinette never developed that partnership. Their 7-year inability to consummate the marriage set a pattern of awkwardness and distance that they never really overcame. They weren't partners. They were 2 people trapped in the same cage, and when the walls started closing in, they couldn't work together effectively enough to escape. It's easy to judge them, sitting here more than 2 centuries later. But try to imagine being in their position, thrust into roles they were completely unprepared for, under immense pressure, with the fate of nations supposedly resting on their shoulders. They were kids when they married. They were still figuring out who they were as individuals when they were expected to represent institutions that were centuries old. It's not surprising they failed. It's surprising they managed as long as they did. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think about Marie Antoinette at 14, walking through that pavilion on the Rhine, leaving behind everything she'd ever known. Think about her last words on the scaffold, "Pardon me, sir." Even at the end, she was trying to be gracious. Her marriage was meant to forge peace, but it ended in revolution. She was supposed to be the bridge between two nations, but she became the symbol of a dying regime. But you know what? The story of royal marriages changing history isn't all tragedy. In fact, our next chapter takes us to a completely different kind of union, one built on genuine love, mutual respect, and a vision of uniting all of Europe through family ties. We're heading to Victorian England now, where a young queen falls genuinely in love with her cousin, and together they create what might be the most ambitious marriage strategy in history. They called Queen Victoria the grandmother of Europe, and for good reason. Her descendants ended up on nearly every royal throne on the continent. It was a brilliant plan that worked almost too well, because those family connections would eventually lead to something nobody anticipated. A world war where cousins were fighting cousins. That extraordinary story is just ahead, so stay with me. What if I told you that one woman's marriage strategy indirectly caused World War I? That sounds impossible, right? But Queen Victoria of Britain had a beautiful, idealistic plan to unite all of Europe through family bonds. She believed that if royal families were all related to each other, if kings and queens were cousins and siblings and in-laws, then they'd never go to war. They'd settle their disputes peacefully, like family members around a dinner table. It was a lovely idea, and for a while it actually seemed to be working. But Victoria made one critical miscalculation. She didn't account for a genetic time bomb hiding in her own bladder mutation that would spread through royal families like wildfire, contributing to the collapse of the Russian Empire and changing the course of the 20th century. This is the story of how love, ambition, and a single faulty gene created the most interconnected royal network in history, and how that network failed spectacularly when it was needed most. Let's start with something unusual. This was actually a love match. Queen Victoria genuinely deeply loved her husband, Prince Albert. And that's rare in our journey through royal marriages so far. Think about it. Ferdinand and Isabella were a political alliance. The Habsburgs married for power. Marie Antoinette barely knew Louis before their wedding. But Victoria and Alberte had real affection for each other, and it made all the difference. They were first cousins. Victoria's mother and Albert's father were siblings, which was completely normal for European royalty at the time. They first met when Victoria was 16 years old in 1835, and according to her diary, she was immediately charmed by him. She wrote that Albert was extremely handsome with beautiful blue eyes, an exquisite nose, and a very sweet mouth. She noticed his fine shoulders and slim waist. For a proper Victorian young lady, this was about as racy as a diary entry could get. But the engagement didn't happen right away. Victoria became queen in 1837 at age 18, and suddenly the power dynamic shifted. She was now the Queen of the United Kingdom, ruler of a vast empire. Albert was just a prince from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a small German duchy. When they became engaged in 1839, Victoria had to propose to him because she was the queen, and queens don't wait to be asked. She wrote that she told Albert it would make me too happy if he would consent to what I wished, and that he was so kind, so affectionate. They married on February 10, 1840, and by all accounts they were genuinely happy together. Albert was brilliant, serious-minded, and deeply interested in science, industry, and social reform. He basically invented the modern concept of the royal consort, a supporting role that involved real work and influence without overshadowing the monarch. He organized the Great Exhibition of 1851, which showcased industrial and cultural achievements from around the world and helped position Britain as the leader of the modern age. Victoria adored him, relied on him, and when he died of typhoid fever in December 1861, at just 42 years old, she was absolutely devastated. She wore black mourning clothes for the remaining 40 years of her life. Their marriage had lasted 21 years, and it produced 9 children. 9 children. This is where our story really begins, because Victoria and Albert saw those children as tools, not in a cruel way, but in a strategic way. They were going to use marriages to create a web of alliances that would bind Europe together. And they were extraordinarily successful at it. By the time Victoria died in 1901, her descendants occupied thrones and married into royal families from Russia to Spain, from Romania to Norway. They called her the grandmother of Europe. And it wasn't just a cute nickname. She literally was related to almost every royal family on the continent. Let's map out this network because it's genuinely impressive. Victoria and Albert's eldest daughter, also named Victoria but called Vicky, married Crown Prince Friedrich of Prussia in 1858. This was Victoria's masterstroke. Prussia was the most powerful of the German states, and Victoria believed they would eventually unite Germany under their rule. Through this marriage, British influence would extend deep into Central Europe. Vicky and Friedrich had 8 children, including the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, who would rule Germany during World War I. Their second child, Albert Edward, became King Edward VII of Britain. He married Alexandra of Denmark in 1863. Their son would become King George V, who ruled Britain during World War I. Princess Alice, Victoria's third child, married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, in 1862. This marriage would have the most far-reaching consequences of all, though nobody knew it at the time. Alice's daughter, Alix of Hesse, would marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia in 1894. Remember that. Name dash were coming back to them. Prince Alfred married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia. Princess Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein. Princess Louise married into Scottish nobility. Prince Arthur married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. Prince Leopold married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Piedmont. And finally, the youngest, Princess Beatrice, married Prince Henry of Battenberg. Are you keeping track of all these marriages? Because I promise you there's going to be a test at the end. Just kidding. But seriously, by the 1880s, Victoria had successfully married her children into nearly every major European dynasty. And then those children had children, and Victoria started arranging their marriages too. At family weddings and funerals, half the crowned heads of Europe would show up, all related to each other through Victoria. The network Victoria created was so extensive that by 1914, when World War I broke out, 3 of the major rulers were her grandchildren. King George V of Britain was Victoria's grandson through her son Edward. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was Victoria's grandson through her daughter Vicky. And Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was married to Victoria's granddaughter, Alix. These 3 men called each other by nicknames Georgie, Willie, and Nicky. They'd spent childhood summers together. They had attended each other's weddings. Their children called each other cousins because that's what they were. And yet, in 1914, they went to war against each other. Britain and Russia fought on one side, Germany fought on the other. The war killed approximately 20 million people and destroyed 4 empires. So much for Victoria's dream of family bonds preventing conflict. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Remember I mentioned a genetic time bomb? Queen Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. People with hemophilia can bleed to death from minor injuries. Even a small cut can be dangerous. This disorder is carried on the X chromosome, which means women can carry the gene without showing symptoms. But when they pass it to their sons, those sons suffer from the disease terribly. Victoria's 8th child, Prince Leopold, had hemophilia. He died at age 30 from a brain hemorrhage after a minor fall. That was tragic, but it got worse. 2 of Victoria's daughters, Alice and Beatrice, were carriers, and they passed the gene to their children, who then married into other royal families and spread it further. The disease became known as the royal disease, and it appeared in the Spanish royal family, the Prussian royal family, and most devastatingly, in the Russian imperial family. Let me tell you about Tsarevich Alexei, because his story shows how one genetic mutation can help topple an empire. Alexei was born in 1904, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. He was the long-awaited male heir to the Russian throne. His parents had 4 daughters first, and the entire empire had been desperately waiting for a son. When he was born, there was celebration across Russia. Church bells rang, cannons fired salutes. This boy would one day rule the largest country on earth. But Alexei had hemophilia. He inherited it from his mother Alexandra, who was Victoria's granddaughter through Princess Alice. And this disease would shape Russian history in ways nobody could have imagined. Imagine being a parent and watching your child suffer from something you can't fix. Every stumble, every bump, every bruise could trigger internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. Alexei spent much of his childhood in excruciating pain. His joints would swell with blood. He'd scream for hours. The best doctors in Russia couldn't help him. Medical science at the time had no treatment for hemophilia beyond bed rest and prayer. Nicholas and Alexandra were desperate, and into that desperation walked Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant, who claimed to have healing powers. Now, historians still debate exactly what Rasputin did to help Alexei. Some think he used hypnosis to calm the boy and slow his heart rate, which would have reduced bleeding. Others think he simply told the doctors to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which is a blood thinner that would have made the hemophilia worse. Whatever he did, it seemed to work. When Alexei was suffering, Rasputin could somehow ease his pain. And this gave Rasputin incredible influence over Alexandra. Alexandra became completely devoted to Rasputin. She believed he was sent by God to save her son. And because Nicholas loved Alexandra and trusted her judgment, Rasputin gained indirect influence over the Tsar himself. This was a disaster for the monarchy's reputation. Rasputin was crude, probably drunk a lot of the time, and there were constant rumors, many of them exaggerated or false, about his sexual exploits. Russian nobles despised him. The public saw his influence over the royal family as evidence that the monarchy was corrupt and incompetent. When World War I began in 1914, things got even worse. Nicholas left to command the army, which meant Alexandra was effectively running the government. And Alexandra consulted Rasputin on major decisions. She appointed and fired ministers based on his advice. The war was going badly. Russia was suffering terrible casualties. The economy was collapsing. Food shortages were becoming critical. And the public blamed Alexandra, calling her the German woman, accusing her of being a spy, spreading rumors that she and Rasputin were having an affair. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. The perception was that the Russian Empire was being run by a hysterical German woman and a drunken peasant mystic. All because the heir to the throne had a disease that made him bleed. In December 1916, a group of nobles decided they'd had enough. They lured Rasputin to a palace, fed him poisoned cakes and wine, and when that didn't kill him fast enough, they shot him. When he still didn't die, they beat him and threw him into the freezing Neva River, where he finally drowned. It's one of history's most bizarre assassinations, but killing Rasputin didn't save the monarchy. It was too late. 3 months later, in March 1917, revolution erupted in Russia. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. The Romanov family was arrested and imprisoned. And then, in July 1918, in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, the entire family, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, including Alexei, and 4 loyal servants, were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries. They were shot and bayoneted, and their bodies were thrown into a mineshaft. Now, I'm not saying that hemophilia caused the Russian Revolution. That would be a huge oversimplification. Russia had deep structural problems, an oppressive political system, economic inequality, military disasters, food shortages. The revolution was going to happen regardless. But hemophilia contributed to the crisis. It gave Rasputin power, which undermined the monarchy's legitimacy. It distracted Nicholas and Alexandra at crucial moments when they needed to be focused on governance. It was one more thread in a tapestry of disaster, and it all traced back to Queen Victoria and her dream of uniting Europe through marriage. She spread her genes far and wide, including the hemophilia mutation. Spanish princes bled to death in childhood. A Prussian prince died at age 4 from a bump on the head. Alexei suffered terribly before his murder at age 13. The royal disease became a symbol of everything that was wrong with hereditary monarchy. The inbreeding, the genetic problems, the sense that these families were playing with forces they didn't understand. But let's go back to World War I for a moment, because this is where Victoria's grand strategy truly failed. In August 1914, when the war began, King George V made a decision that shows just how completely family bonds had collapsed. His government advised him that having German names and titles was politically problematic while Britain was at war with Germany. So George changed the royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Albert's German family name to Windsor, which sounded properly British. He also stripped his German relatives of their British titles and honours, including his own first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm was furious and hurt. He'd always admired Britain. He'd been at Victoria's deathbed when she died in 1901, holding her hand. He would have loved his grandmother. But now his British cousins had publicly rejected him. The family network that was supposed to prevent war hadn't just failed, it had become another casualty of the conflict. And yet, in private letters, you can still see the family connections straining to remain relevant. In July 1914, just before the war started, Wilhelm sent a telegram to his cousin George, trying to prevent Britain from entering the conflict. He addressed it to Georgie and signed it Willie. George replied, also using their childhood nicknames. These men were trying to prevent a war while their governments were preparing for it, and the governments won. Family loyalty couldn't compete with national interests, military alliances, and the momentum of history. The irony is almost painful. Victoria had believed that family bonds would prevent European wars. Instead, Europe had its most devastating war ever, and family members were killing each other's soldiers by the millions. Wilhelm's Germans fought George's British. Nicholas's Russians fought Wilhelm's Germans until Russia collapsed into revolution. The family network held no power when it mattered most. So, what's the lesson here? What do we take from Victoria's grand experiment? I think there are a few things. First, family bonds are important, but they're not stronger than national interests, political ideologies, or economic forces. You can't solve systemic problems with personal Relationships. Victoria's descendants might have loved each other, but when their nation's interests conflicted, the nations won every time. Second, even the best intentions can have unintended consequences. Victoria wasn't trying to spread hemophilia through European royalty. She didn't even know she was a carrier until her son Leopold showed symptoms. But by the time they understood what was happening, the damage was done. Her daughters had already married and had children. The gene was spreading through the royal houses of Europe. Third, genetics doesn't care about your status. You can be the most powerful family in the world, but you're still subject to the same biological laws as everyone else. The Habsburgs learned this lesson through inbreeding. Victoria's descendants learned it through hemophilia. No amount of wealth or power can override fundamental genetic realities. But here's something interesting to think about as you settle deeper into your pillows tonight. Victoria's strategy almost worked. For most of the 19th century, Europe was relatively peaceful. The major powers didn't fight massive wars against each other. Maybe the family network helped with that. Maybe knowing that your cousin ruled the neighboring country made diplomacy a little easier, made compromise a little more likely. The network didn't prevent World War I, but maybe it delayed it. Maybe without those family connections, European powers would have torn each other apart decades earlier. And there's something touching about the way Victoria approached this. She genuinely believed in the power of family. She'd had a happy marriage with Albert. She would have loved her children and grandchildren. She thought that if everyone felt the way she did about family, if everyone had those personal connections, then surely they'd choose peace. It was naive, but it was also kind of beautiful. She was trying to make the world better through love and connection. It didn't work the way she hoped, but can we really fault her for trying? The hemophilia gene that Victoria carried died out, by the way. The last known carrier in a royal family was probably Prince Waldemar of Prussia, who died in 1945. Modern medicine can treat hemophilia now with clotting factor replacement. So even if the gene still existed in some royal lineage, it wouldn't have the same devastating impact. But in Victoria's time, and in the early 20th century, it was a death sentence, a source of incredible suffering, and a political liability that helped bring down dynasties. As your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, think about little Alexei in Russia, suffering from a disease his great-great-grandmother unknowingly gave him, his pain being used by a mystic to gain power, his illness contributing to the fall of an empire that had lasted 300 years. Think about Victoria herself, believing she was building bridges across Europe, not realizing she was also spreading a genetic time bomb. History is full of these ironies, these unexpected consequences, these moments where our best intentions lead to unimaginable outcomes. Now, we've spent time with marriages built on strategy, on political calculation, on the dream of uniting nations through family bonds. But what happens when a king decides he doesn't need alliances or heirs from a politically advantageous marriage? What happens when personal desire overrides centuries of diplomatic tradition? We're traveling back in time now to 16th century England, where King Henry VIII loved his Spanish wife until he didn't. And when he decided he needed a divorce, he was willing to break apart Western Christianity itself to get it. This is the marriage that split the church, that changed the religious landscape of Europe, that began with genuine affection and ended with Henry declaring himself the head of a new church. That remarkable story is waiting just ahead. So stay with me as we explore how one man's obsession with producing a male heir literally redrew the religious map of the Western world. Sometimes a marriage fails not because of lack of love, but because of too much obsession. King Henry VIII of England genuinely loved his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. He called her his true and loving wife. He wore her initials on his jousting armor. For nearly 20 years they were partners, lovers and co-rulers. But Henry wanted something Catherine couldn't give him, a living son to inherit his throne. And that obsession, that desperate need for a male heir, would lead Henry to do something unprecedented in Western history. He would break England away from the Catholic Church, declare himself supreme head of the Church of England, dissolve hundreds of monasteries, redistribute massive amounts of wealth and land, and fundamentally transform English society. All because he wanted a divorce. This is the marriage that split Western Christianity, and it started with genuine affection and optimism. Let's go back to June 11th, 1509. Henry is just 18 years old, newly crowned king after his father's death. He's athletic, handsome, intelligent, musical, everything a Renaissance prince should be. And he's about to marry Catherine of Aragon, who is 23 years old and happens to be his brother's widow. Yes, you heard that right. Catherine had originally been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, but Arthur died just months after their wedding in 1502. This created a complicated situation. According to church law, a man couldn't marry his brother's widow. It was considered incestuous based on biblical texts. But there was a loophole. If the first marriage had never been consummated, if Catherine and Arthur had never actually slept together, then she wasn't really Arthur's widow in the eyes of God. She was just a woman who had gone through a wedding ceremony. Catherine swore under oath that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she was still a virgin, and with that testimony, plus a papal dispensation from Pope Julius II, she was free to marry Henry. Why did Henry want to marry his brother's widow? Politics and money. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, yes, the same Ferdinand and Isabella who unified Spain and funded Columbus. She represented an alliance with one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Her dowry was substantial, and honestly, Henry probably liked her. She was well-educated, pious, dignified, and experienced in court life. She could be a real partner to him. And for the first decade or so, it really worked. Henry and Catherine seemed genuinely happy together. She served as Regent of England in 1513 when Henry was away fighting in France, and she handled a Scottish invasion brilliantly, even sending Henry the bloodied coat of the Scottish king who died in battle. Can you imagine getting that in the mail from your wife? Hey honey, I won a war while you were gone. Here's proof. Catherine was capable, intelligent, and devoted to Henry. But here's where the tragedy begins. Catherine got pregnant a lot. Between 1510 and 1518 she had at least 6 pregnancies. But medieval pregnancy was incredibly dangerous, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Her first child, a daughter, was stillborn. Then she had a son, Henry, who lived for just 52 days before dying. Another son was stillborn. Another son died within hours of birth. A daughter died soon after birth. Out of all those pregnancies, only one child survived, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. Now, we need to understand something about 16th century England. The country had just emerged from the Wars of the Roses, decades of brutal civil war between competing royal families fighting over the throne. Henry's father, Henry VII, had won the crown on the battlefield in 1485, establishing the Tudor dynasty. But the Tudors were still relatively new to power. Their claim to the throne wasn't as strong as they wanted people to believe, and England had never been successfully ruled by a queen in her own right. There were serious doubts about whether a woman could command the loyalty of nobles, lead armies, maintain order. Henry was terrified that if he died without a male heir, England would descend back into civil war. Different factions would back different claimants to the throne. The carefully built Tudor dynasty would collapse. Everything his father had fought for would be lost. This wasn't just personal vanity, though there was definitely some of that. Henry genuinely believed that England needed a king, not a queen, and that meant he needed a son. By the mid-1520s, Henry was becoming desperate. Catherine was 40 years old. She had gone through menopause. There would be no more children. And Henry had noticed one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, a young woman named Anne Boleyn. Anne was in her mid-20s, intelligent, witty, fashionable, and she had spent time at the French court, which gave her a complicated edge. She wasn't conventionally beautiful by the standards of the time. Contemporary descriptions suggest she was rather thin with dark eyes and dark hair, but she was magnetic. Henry was obsessed. Now, if this were just about Henry wanting to sleep with Anne Boleyn, it wouldn't have been a problem. Kings had mistresses all the time. It was expected. Henry had already had at least one mistress, Mary Boleyn, who was actually Anne's older sister. Nobody cared. But Anne Boleyn refused to become just another mistress. She wanted to be queen, and for that to happen, Henry needed to annul his marriage to Catherine. This is what became known as the King's Great Matter. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place. He pointed to a verse in the biblical book of Leviticus that says, "If a man takes his brother's wife, they shall be childless." Henry said this proved that God was punishing him for marrying Catherine. That's why their sons had died. The papal dispensation that allowed the marriage must have been invalid, because no pope could contradict God's law. Therefore, he and Catherine had been living in sin for 20 years, and he needed an annulment. Catherine fought back. She insisted again under oath that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She argued that her marriage to Henry was completely valid, blessed by the Pope, and sacred in the eyes of God. She wasn't going to quietly retire to a convent and accept being cast aside after 20 years of faithful service. And she had powerful support. Her nephew was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who controlled much of Europe, including Rome itself. This is where things get really complicated. Henry needed Pope Clement VII to grant the annulment. But Clement was in a terrible position. In 1527, just as Henry was asking for the annulment, Charles V's army sacked Rome. They literally invaded the Vatican, killed thousands of people, and held the Pope as a Virtual prisoner, the Pope couldn't possibly grant an annulment that would humiliate Charles's aunt. He stalled, he delayed, he sent investigators to England to examine the case. But he wouldn't give Henry what he wanted. Henry waited and waited. Years passed. Anne Boleyn was getting older. By 1532 she was in her 30s, which in that era meant her childbearing years were running out. Henry needed to act, and this is where he made the decision that would change everything. If the Pope wouldn't give him permission, he'd find another way. He would break England's allegiance to Rome and create his own church. Let me be clear about something. This wasn't primarily about theology. Henry wasn't Martin Luther challenging Catholic doctrine on philosophical grounds. Henry actually hated Luther. He'd written a treatise defending Catholic sacraments against Luther's criticisms, and the Pope had given him the title Defender of the Faith for it. Henry was a Catholic. He believed in most Catholic teachings. He just wanted a divorce, and he was willing to restructure the entire English church to get it. Between 1532 and 1534, Henry and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell pushed through a series of laws that completely transformed England's relationship with Rome. The Act of Appeals in 1533 declared that England was an empire unto itself, not subject to any foreign authority, meaning the Pope. This allowed English courts to rule on Henry's annulment without papal approval. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who owed his position to Henry, granted the annulment. Catherine was declared to have never been Henry's true wife. Mary was declared illegitimate. And on January 25, 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. She was already pregnant. They'd finally slept together, banking on the annulment coming through. On June 1st, she was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony. On September 7th, she gave birth to a child. Henry was convinced it would be the son he'd been praying for. It was a daughter. Henry must have been devastated, but he didn't give up. Anne could still have sons, except she didn't. She had at least 2 miscarriages, including one in 1536 that was probably a boy. And by this point, Henry had noticed another lady in waiting, Jane Seymour. The pattern was repeating. Henry needed a son. His current wife wasn't providing one, so he'd move on to the next woman. But he couldn't just annul another marriage. He'd already caused a massive schism in Western Christianity over the first one. So instead, Thomas Cromwell manufactured charges of adultery, incest, and treason against Anne. She was accused of sleeping with 5 different men, including her own brother. The charges were almost certainly false. The timeline didn't work. The evidence was coerced. The whole thing was clearly political. But Anne was arrested, tried, and found guilty. On May 19, 1536, she was beheaded by a French swordsman specially. Brought over from Calais, she faced her death with courage, reportedly saying, "The king has been very good to me. He promoted me from a simple maid to a marchioness. Then he raised me to be a queen. Now he will raise me to be a martyr." Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later. And finally, Jane gave him what he wanted. A son, Edward, born on October 12, 1537. Henry was ecstatic. He had his heir. The Tudor succession was secure. But Jane died 12 days later, probably from complications of childbirth or infection. Henry genuinely mourned her and would later choose to be buried beside her. The boy Edward would become Edward VI when Henry died in 1547. But Edward was sickly and died at age 15 in 1553 without producing any heirs. So who inherited the throne? Mary Catherine's daughter, the one Henry had declared illegitimate. She ruled for 5 years, earning the nickname Bloody Mary for her attempts to return England to Catholicism and her persecution of Protestants. When she died childless in 1558, the throne passed to Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's daughter, also declared illegitimate, also childless. Elizabeth would rule for 45 years and become one of England's greatest monarchs. The irony is almost too much. Henry destroyed his marriage, split the church, executed countless people, caused decades of religious turmoil, all to get a male heir. And in the end, his kingdom was saved and elevated by the 2 daughters he'd tried to disinherit. The son he'd wanted so desperately died young and left no legacy. The daughters he dismissed as inadequate became 2 of the most significant monarchs in English history. History has a sense of humor sometimes. But let's talk about what Henry's break with Rome actually meant for England. Because this wasn't just about one man's marital problems. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry dissolved all the monasteries in England. We're talking about over 800 religious houses, monasteries, convents, friaries. This was the dissolution of the monasteries, and it was one of the largest redistributions of wealth in English history. The monasteries owned approximately 1/4 of all land in England. They were schools, hospitals, libraries, and centres of learning. They provided charity to the poor, employment to thousands, and stability to communities. Yes, some were corrupt and wealthy, but many were doing important social work. Henry shut them all down, seized their land and wealth, and sold most of it to nobles and merchants. This created a whole new class of wealthy landowners whose fortunes depended on Henry's break with Rome continuing. They had a vested interest in ensuring England never returned to Catholicism, because that might mean giving back the monastery lands. This also meant that hundreds of monks, nuns, and friars were suddenly turned out with nowhere to go. The poor lost their sources of charity. Priceless medieval libraries were destroyed or scattered. Beautiful. Buildings were demolished or left to ruin. It was cultural vandalism on a massive scale, or to fill Henry's treasury and buy loyalty from the nobility. The religious transformation didn't stop there. England became officially Protestant, though Henry himself remained doctrinally Catholic in most ways. He wanted the structure and wealth of the Catholic Church transferred to English control, but he wasn't interested in Lutheran theology. This created a weird hybrid. The Church of England was Catholic in ritual but Protestant in authority structure. It would take decades to sort out, leading to religious persecution, martyrdoms, and political instability. Think about the ordinary people living through this. In 1529, England had been Catholic for 1,000 years. By 1540, the Pope's authority was rejected. Monasteries were closing. Priests who refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the church were being executed. If you were a devout Catholic, your entire religious world had been turned upside down. If you were inclined toward Protestantism, you were cautiously optimistic but confused about what was actually allowed. Under Mary's reign in the 1550s, Catholicism came back and Protestants were burned at the stake. Then, under Elizabeth, Protestantism returned and Catholics were persecuted. Imagine having your fundamental beliefs about salvation and God whipped back and forth like that for decades. And all of it traces back to Henry's marriage to Catherine failing to produce a surviving son. If Catherine had given birth to a healthy boy in, say, 1513, and he'd lived, Henry probably would have remained contentedly married. England would have stayed Catholic. The monasteries would have survived. The religious map of Europe would look different. It's a stunning example of how personal circumstances at the highest levels of power can reshape entire societies. Here's something that keeps me up at night thinking about this story. Catherine of Aragon did nothing wrong. She was a faithful wife, a capable regent, an intelligent advisor, a devoted mother. She performed every duty expected of her. The fact that her sons didn't survive wasn't her fault. Infant mortality was high for everyone, royal or not, and yet she was cast aside, declared to have never been truly married, separated from her daughter, forced to live in increasingly uncomfortable conditions until she died in 1536, possibly from cancer. Henry wouldn't even let her see Mary before she died. And Anne Boleyn was also not really her fault. She couldn't control whether she gave birth to sons or daughters. And the charges against her adultery, incest, treason were fabricated. She died because Henry wanted to move on to wife number 3. 5 other men were executed alongside her, also probably innocent. Their lives sacrificed to give Henry's accusations credibility. It's a reminder that in systems where power is concentrated in one person, where that person's personal desires become confused with national interest, terrible injustices can happen. Henry convinced himself that his need for a male heir was England's need, that God wanted him to have a son, that anyone standing in the way of that goal, whether his loyal wife of 20 years or the Pope himself, was an enemy to be removed. But here's the thing that makes this story even more complex. Henry's break with Rome, as unjust and self-serving as it was, did open the door for genuine religious reform in England. During Edward's brief reign, and especially during Elizabeth's long reign, England became a haven for Protestant thought. The English Bible became available to ordinary people. Literacy increased because people wanted to read scripture. Religious debate flourished in ways that would have been impossible under papal authority. Shakespeare wrote his plays in an England transformed by Henry's actions. I'm not saying the ends justify the means. The suffering caused by Henry's actions was real and terrible. But history is messy, and sometimes tyrannical actions by flawed people create unintended consequences that later generations value. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it's true. We can condemn Henry's treatment of Catherine and Anne while also recognizing that the world he created, however accidentally, had some positive elements. As you sink deeper into sleep tonight, think about Catherine of Aragon, exiled and alone, praying for a husband who had abandoned her and a daughter she wasn't allowed to see. Think about Anne Boleyn walking to her execution with dignity, knowing she was innocent. Think about Henry himself, so desperate for a son that he tore apart his kingdom to get one, only to have his daughters prove more capable than the son ever did. Sometimes what we think we need most desperately isn't what we need at all. The next marriage we're exploring takes us east, far from the religious politics of Western Europe. We're traveling to Muscovy in the 15th century, where a Byzantine princess fled the ruins of Constantinople and married a Russian prince who barely ranked as civilized by European standards. But this princess brought something with her, a legacy, an ideology, and a vision. She transformed her adopted homeland from a backwater into an empire, creating the mythology of Russia as the third Rome, the heir to Byzantine glory. Her marriage didn't just unite two people, it transferred an entire civilization. That extraordinary story is just ahead. Picture a princess standing in the ruins of the greatest city in the world, watching everything she's ever known burn to ashes. Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the capital of Eastern Christianity, has just fallen to the Ottoman Turks. It's May 29th, 1453, and Zoe Paleologina is about 12 years old. Her uncle, Emperor Constantine XI, has died defending the city walls. His body will never be found. Her family, the Palaiologos dynasty that had ruled Byzantium for 2 centuries, is now homeless, scattered, desperate. Zoe will eventually flee to Rome, living on papal charity, just another refugee from a lost empire. But this princess carries something invisible and powerful, the legacy of Rome itself. And in 19 years, she'll marry a rough-edged Russian prince and transfer that legacy to a land most Europeans consider barely civilized. Through her marriage, Moscow will become the third Rome, and Russia will transform from a Mongol tributary state into an empire that would last until 1917. This is the story of how one woman brought an entire civilization with her as a dowry. Let's start with what Zoe lost, because you can't understand what she brought to Russia without understanding what Byzantium meant. The Byzantine Empire wasn't just another medieval kingdom. It was the direct continuation of the Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, the eastern half kept going. Nearly 1,000 more years, Byzantine emperors ruled from Constantinople, claiming unbroken succession back to Augustus Caesar. They preserved Greek and Roman learning through the Dark Ages. They created magnificent art and architecture. Their legal code influenced all of Europe, and they were the guardians of Orthodox Christianity, the form of Christianity that had developed in the Greek-speaking East, distinct from Roman Catholicism. By the 15th century, Byzantium was a shadow of its former glory. The mighty empire that had once controlled the entire Mediterranean had shrunk to basically just Constantinople and a few surrounding territories. The Ottoman Turks, expanding rapidly under Sultan Mehmed II, wanted Constantinople for themselves. It was strategically located, controlling the passage between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And on a symbolic level, Mehmed wanted to prove that Islamic power had surpassed Christian power. Taking Constantinople would be the ultimate statement. The siege lasted 53 days, finally fell to Ottoman cannons. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia and charged into battle as a common soldier when he saw the walls breached. He was never seen again. His body was never identified. The city was sacked, tens of thousands were killed or enslaved, and the great Hagia Sophia Cathedral was converted into a mosque. The Byzantine Empire was over. Zoe's father, Thomas Palaiologos, was the emperor's brother and ruled a small territory in the Peloponnese. When the Ottomans came for his land too, he fled with his family, first to Corfu, then eventually to Rome. They arrived as beggars, essentially. Everything was gone, the wealth, the palaces, the power. They were dependent on the charity of the Pope and wealthy Italian families. Zoe grew up in this strange exile, caught between two worlds. She was a princess of a fallen empire, raised in the traditions of Orthodox Christianity but living in Catholic Rome, speaking Greek in a Latin-speaking world, remembering a glory that no longer existed. The Pope at the time, Paul II, saw an opportunity. There was a prince in distant Moscow, Ivan III, Grand Prince of Muscovy, who was young, widowed, and looking for a wife. The Pope had a clever plan. If he could marry this Byzantine princess to the Russian prince, maybe he could use their influence to bring the Orthodox Church in Russia into union with Rome. Religious unity between East and West had been a papal dream for centuries. So in 1469, the Pope proposed the match. Would Zoe consider marrying Ivan? Now, let's talk about what Zoe was getting into, because Ivan's Muscovy was not impressive by Byzantine standards. Moscow was a wooden city in a swampy forest, cold most of the year, provincial, unsophisticated. The Principality of Muscovy was still paying tribute to the Mongol horde, which had conquered Russia back in the 13th century. Russian princes had to travel to the horde to receive approval for their rule, to bow before the Khan, to hand over portions of their tax revenue. Russia was, in the eyes of most Europeans, a barbaric backwater on the edge of civilization. But Ivan was ambitious. He'd been consolidating power, absorbing neighboring principalities, building Moscow's strength. And marrying a Byzantine princess would give him something invaluable: legitimacy. Through Zoe, he could claim to be the heir to the Byzantine emperors. He could position Moscow as the new center of Orthodox Christianity, the successor to Constantinople. It was a bold vision, and it required Zoe's cooperation. The journey from Rome to Moscow took 2 years of negotiation and then months of travel. Zoe left Rome in June 1472 with a large entourage: Italian craftsmen, Greek scholars, Byzantine clerics, servants, and a papal legate who was supposed to promote Catholic Orthodox unity. They traveled through Germany and Poland, and at every stop, people came out to see this Byzantine princess, this living link to ancient Rome. Can you imagine what that journey must have been like? Leaving the warm Mediterranean for the frozen north, traveling further and further from everything familiar, knowing you could never go back. Zoe arrived in Moscow in November 1472, right as winter was setting in. The wedding took place almost immediately November 12, 1472, in the Dormition Cathedral in Moscow. The papal legate expected to have a prominent role in the ceremony, maybe even perform the marriage according to Catholic rites. Instead, Orthodox priests conducted the entire ceremony. The legate was humiliated. The Pope's plan to use the marriage to bring Russia into Catholic orbit had failed before it even began. Zoe had made her choice. She would be Russian and Orthodox, not a Catholic agent in Moscow. And then Zoe, who took the name Sophia upon converting to Orthodoxy, began to transform her new home. She brought Byzantine court ceremony to Moscow. Before Sophia, the Muscovite court was relatively simple and informal. After Sophia, it adopted elaborate Byzantine rituals. The Grand Prince became more distant, more elevated, more imperial. Audiences with him became formal ceremonies with specific protocols. This wasn't just about showing off, it was about creating an aura of authority, making the prince seem more like an emperor. She brought Byzantine architecture. Italian craftsmen she'd brought with her designed and built new stone structures in Moscow, including parts of the Kremlin. Before this, Moscow was mostly wooden buildings. Sophia's architects introduced Renaissance techniques combined with Byzantine aesthetics, creating a distinctive style that would become characteristic of Russian architecture. She brought the Byzantine double-headed eagle as a symbol of power. Ivan even adopted it as his emblem, and it would remain the symbol of Russian imperial authority until 1917. That eagle symbolized power over East and West, the claim to be the heir to both Rome and Byzantium. Most importantly, she brought an ideology. Sophia and the Greek monks in her entourage promoted the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. The logic went like this: Rome had been the first center of Christianity, but it had fallen into heresy by embracing Catholicism and its errors. Constantinople had been the second Rome, the true keeper of Orthodox Christianity, but it had fallen to the Muslim Ottomans as punishment for considering union with the Catholic West. Now Moscow was the third and final Rome, the last bastion of true Christianity. And just as there had been no fourth universal empire after Rome, there would be no fourth Rome after Moscow. This was it. This was the end of history. Moscow would stand forever as the guardian of true faith. A monk named Philophi would later write to Ivan's son, "Two Romes have fallen, but the third stands, and a fourth there shall not be." This wasn't just religious theory. It was political ideology that justified Russian expansion, Russian authority over other Orthodox peoples, Russian resistance to Western influence. It shaped Russian identity for centuries. In 1480, something extraordinary happened that seemed to confirm this ideology. The Golden Horde sent representatives to Moscow demanding tribute, as they had for over 2 centuries. Ivan refused. He stood on the banks of the Ugra River with his army facing the Mongol forces. Neither side attacked. They just stared at each other across the river for weeks. Finally, the Mongols withdrew. The Tatar yoke, the 240 years of Mongol domination over Russia was over. Russia was free. Historians debate how much credit Sophia deserves for this. Did she stiffen Ivan's resolve? Did the Byzantine princess convince the Russian prince that he was an emperor who didn't bow to Khans? We can't know for certain, but the timing is suggestive. Had been paying tribute his whole life, just like his father and grandfather before him. But a few years after marrying Sophia, after absorbing Byzantine ideas about imperial authority and Moscow's divine mission, he found the courage to say no. Sophia and Ivan had 12 children together. though several died young. Their son Vasily became Vasily III, and their grandson became Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, the first Russian ruler to officially take the title Tsar, which derives from Caesar. The title itself was a direct claim to Roman succession. Caesar to Tsar, Rome to Moscow. The line was supposedly unbroken, and it all traced back to Sophia's marriage. Now you might be wondering, did Sophia and Ivan love each other? The historical record doesn't give us much insight into their personal relationship. We know Ivan respected her intelligence and consulted her on political matters. We know she maintained her own court and had significant influence. Observers noted that after their marriage, Ivan became more confident, more imperial in his bearing. One Italian visitor to Moscow wrote that before Sophia's arrival, the Muscovite court was barbarous, but afterward it had taken on majesty. Whether there was romantic love, we simply don't know. But there was definitely partnership, and there was definitely mutual benefit. Sophia died on April 7, 1503, at around 60 years old. She'd been in Russia for over 30 years longer than she'd lived anywhere else. She'd transformed from a refugee princess into the Grand Princess of Muscovy, the mother of the heir, the architect of Russian imperial ideology. She was buried with full honors in the Ascension Convent in the Moscow Kremlin. Here's what's remarkable about Sophia's story. She didn't conquer Russia militarily. She didn't arrive with an army or wealth. She arrived as an exile with nothing but her name and her heritage. And yet she fundamentally changed Russian identity and Russian political culture. How? Through the power of ideas, symbolism, and legitimacy. Sophia understood something profound. In medieval and early modern politics, legitimacy mattered enormously. It wasn't enough to have power. You needed to justify that power with a narrative that people would accept. Ivan was already the most powerful prince in Russia, but Sophia gave him a story that elevated him from regional strongman to heir of empires. That story made it easier for other Russian princes to accept his authority, easier for the Orthodox Church to support him, easier for his subjects to see him as something special, divinely ordained. This is a pattern we see throughout history. Exiled royalty carrying legitimacy with them like portable. Think about it, the Stuart pretenders to the British throne lived in exile in France and Rome for decades, but they were still treated as kings by their supporters because of the legitimacy they represented. Napoleon's nephew lived in exile for years before becoming Napoleon III. The legitimacy of a bloodline, a dynasty, a historical claimant has power even when separated from actual political control. But Sophia's influence goes beyond medieval politics. The ideology she helped promote Moscow as the Third Rome, Russia as the guardian of true Christianity, Russian exceptionalism and messianic mission shaped Russian identity for centuries. It influenced the expansion of the Russian Empire. It affected how Russia related to Western Europe, always with this sense of being fundamentally different, having a unique spiritual mission. It colored Russian Orthodoxy's relationship with other Christian churches. And echoes of it persist even today in debates about Russian identity and Russia's place in the world. There's something beautiful and something troubling about this legacy. Beautiful because it shows how ideas can transcend political collapse, how a culture can survive the death of its political structures. Byzantium fell, but Byzantine culture didn't die. It migrated, adapted, and found new expression in Russia. That's resilience. That's the power of cultural continuity. But troubling because the Third Rome ideology also fostered isolationism, xenophobia, and imperial ambition. If Moscow was the final Rome, the last bastion of true faith, then other cultures and religions were inherently suspect. Western Christians were heretics, Muslims were infidels. The Orthodox world needed to be united under Moscow's leadership. This ideology justified conquest, suppression of minorities, and resistance to reform. Ideas have consequences, and not all of them are positive. I wonder sometimes what Sophia thought about it all. She lived through the fall of one empire and the rise of another. She saw Constantinople, the greatest city in the world, reduced to ruins. She saw Moscow, a provincial town, begin its transformation into an imperial capital. She lost everything as a child and somehow managed to transfer her lost civilization's heritage to a new land. Did she see herself as continuing Byzantium or as creating something new? Did she mourn what was lost or celebrate what was being built? We'll never know what was in her heart. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think about this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can carry with you isn't wealth or weapons, but identity and legitimacy. Sophia arrived in Moscow with nothing material, but she brought the weight of 1,000 years of Roman and Byzantine history. And that invisible inheritance proved more valuable than gold. She transformed how an entire nation saw itself, how it understood its place in history, how it justified its ambitions. One marriage, one woman, transferring one. civilization to another. But marriage as a political tool could work in other directions too. What happens when a marriage is meant to unite kingdoms but instead holds them carefully separate? When a couple rules together but keeps their nations distinctly independent? We're heading back to Britain now, but to Scotland first, to meet King James VI, who married a Danish princess in one of the most romantic gestures any king ever made. He sailed through a storm to meet her when her ship couldn't reach Scotland. But this marriage would have consequences far beyond romance. It would lead to the union of the crowns joining Scotland and England under one monarch, while keeping them as separate kingdoms. And it would lead to one of history's most famous failed terrorist attacks. That fascinating story awaits us next. Here's something you don't see every day: a king personally sailing into a storm to rescue his bride-to-be. Most royal marriages involved proxy ceremonies, political calculations, and couples meeting for the first time on their wedding day. But in 1589, 23-year-old King James VI of Scotland did something extraordinary. When his 14-year-old fiancée, Anne of Denmark, tried to sail to Scotland for their wedding but was driven back by terrible storms, James decided he couldn't wait. He gathered a fleet of ships and sailed through the same dangerous waters to reach her. It was reckless, romantic, and completely out of character for the normally cautious, scholarly king. And that marriage, which began with such an unusual romantic gesture, would eventually unite the crowns of Scotland and England, creating the foundation for modern Britain. But it would also trigger a bizarre witch-hunting panic, a famous terrorist plot, and enough religious conflict to last for generations. Let's set the scene, because Scotland in 1589 was a complicated, dangerous place. James had been King of Scotland since he was 13 months old, literally a baby. King crowned after his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate. His childhood was brutal. He was separated from his mother when he was 10 months old and never saw her again. Different noble factions fought for control of him and the kingdom. He was educated brilliantly but traumatically, forced to study for hours every day under strict tutors. By the time he was in his early 20s, he'd survived kidnappings, noble rebellions, and constant threats to his authority. Scotland was divided between Catholics and Protestants, between rival noble families, between those loyal to the crown and those pursuing their own interests. James needed allies, stability, and most importantly, an heir. Denmark seemed like a perfect match. Anne of Denmark was the daughter of King Frederick II, from a Protestant nation and a naval power. The alliance would strengthen Scotland's position in northern Europe. Anne was reportedly pretty, well-educated, and came with a substantial dowry. Marriage negotiations went smoothly, and they arranged for Anne to sail to Scotland for the wedding in autumn 1589. But the North Sea had other plans. Anne's fleet left Denmark in September, sailing around the coast of Norway, heading for Scotland. Then massive storms hit. The ships were battered by winds and waves. They tried multiple times to continue, but were driven back each time. Finally, they gave up and took shelter in Norway, sending word to James that Anne couldn't complete the journey. Most kings would have waited. They would have rescheduled for spring when the seas were calmer. But James, for reasons historians still debate, decided to go get her himself. In October, he sailed from Scotland with a small fleet, braving the same storms that had stopped Anne. Maybe he was genuinely impatient to meet her. Maybe he was making a political statement about his determination and courage. Maybe he was just young and impulsive. Whatever his motivation, he made it to Norway, and he and Anne were married by proxy in Oslo on November 23, 1589, with a formal ceremony following on November 25. James spent several months in Denmark and Norway with Anne, which was unprecedented. Scottish kings didn't just leave their kingdoms for extended foreign visits. While he was there, he attended intellectual discussions with Danish scholars, visited Danish churches and courts, and generally acted more like a tourist than a king worried about his throne. Meanwhile, back in Scotland, nobles were scrambling to manage things in his absence. It must have been nerve-wracking for everyone except James, who seemed to be having the time of his life. But here's where things get weird. When James and Anne finally returned to Scotland in May 1590, James had become convinced that the storms that had threatened Anne's journey were caused by witchcraft, not just natural bad weather, but actual witches deliberately creating supernatural storms to harm him. And this wasn't just paranoia. There had been rumors in Denmark about witches confessing to raising storms. James became obsessed with the idea that he was being personally targeted by a vast conspiracy of witches. This kicked off the North Berwick witch trials, one of the largest and most brutal witch hunts in Scottish history. Over 100 people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft. They were tortured until they confessed to impossible things: flying through the air, meeting with the devil, conducting rituals to raise storms against the king. A woman named Agnes Sampson was accused of being the ringleader. She was stripped, shaved, and had pins driven into her body searching for the devil's mark that witches supposedly bore. She was tortured with the pillywinks, a device that crushed fingers, and the boots, which crushed legs. Under this torture, she confessed to meeting with over 200 witches and raising storms to sink James's ship. James personally attended some of these interrogations. Fascinated and terrified, he even wrote a book about witchcraft called Demonology in 1597, arguing that witches were real, that they made pacts with Satan, and that they needed to be hunted down and executed. This book would later influence witch trials in England and even in the American colonies. The Salem witch trials in 1692 were partly inspired by ideas from James's book, all because a storm delayed his wedding, and he couldn't accept that it was just weather. But let's talk about Anne herself, because she deserves more than to be just a footnote in James's witch-hunting obsession. Anne was intelligent, cultured, and much more capable than historians gave her credit for until recently. She learned to speak English fluently, not easy, considering she arrived speaking only Danish and a bit of French. She patronized the arts, supported theatre and poetry, commissioned masks and performances. She maintained her own court separate from James, which gave her independence and political influence. She bore 7 children, though only 3 survived to adulthood: Henry, Elizabeth, and Charles. Henry died at 18. Elizabeth became the Winter Queen of Bohemia, and Charles would become King Charles I. Anne also converted to Catholicism at some point, though she kept it secret for years because it would have been politically disastrous in Protestant Scotland. This created tension with James, who was Protestant and had written extensively defending Protestantism. But Anne was stubborn and principled in her own way. She believed what she believed, and she wasn't going to change just because it was inconvenient. The marriage between James and Anne was functional but not particularly close. They maintained separate households, which was normal for royalty but still significant. James had intense emotional relationships with male favorites. Historians debate whether these were romantic or just the intense friendships common among men of that era. Anne clearly resented James's male favorites, particularly after one of them, Robert Carr, was implicated in a murder scandal. But Anne and James worked together when necessary, presenting a united front on political matters, even if their personal relationship was distant. Now, here's where this marriage changes history in a major way. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I of England died without children. England needed a new monarch, and James, through his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor, who had been Henry VIII's sister, had a claim to the English throne. In fact, he had the best claim. So at age 36, James VI of Scotland also became James I of England. For the first time since the Norman conquest in 1066, Scotland and England had the same monarch. This is called the Union of the Crowns, and it's important to understand what it did and didn't mean. Scotland and England remained separate kingdoms with separate parliaments, separate laws, separate churches, separate governments. They just happened to have the same king. James ruled Scotland from England, which meant Scottish nobles had to travel to London if they wanted royal favour. Scotland essentially became the junior partner in this relationship, which created resentment that lasted for generations. James desperately wanted to create a full political union, one kingdom, one parliament, one legal system. He even proposed calling the unified kingdom Great Britain, which he thought sounded impressive. But both English and Scottish parliaments rejected the idea. The English didn't want to share power with Scotland. The Scots didn't want to be absorbed by England. So the kingdoms remained separate, which created awkward legal and political situations. People born in Scotland after 1603 were considered English subjects in England, but people born before were foreigners. How do you even enforce that? It was messy. The full political union wouldn't happen until 1707, during the reign of Anne James and Anne of Denmark's granddaughter, who was also the last Stuart monarch. But the union of the crowns in 1603 set the process in motion, and it all traced back to James's marriage to Anne, which produced the children who would inherit both kingdoms. Now, we need to talk about the Gunpowder Plot, because it's directly connected to James's kingship and the religious tensions his marriage navigated. When James became King of England, English Catholics hoped he'd be more tolerant than Elizabeth had been. After all, his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been Catholic, and his wife, Anne, was secretly Catholic. Maybe he'd ease the restrictions, allow Catholics to worship freely, stop the fines and persecutions. But James disappointed them. He maintained all the anti-Catholic laws. Catholics couldn't hold public office, couldn't worship openly, faced heavy fines for not attending Protestant services. Some English Catholics decided that if James wouldn't give them religious freedom, they'd replace him with someone who would, preferably. By blowing him up, the plan was audacious and insane. A group of Catholic conspirators led by Robert Catesby decided to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament on November 5, 1605, when the King, the Queen, the Prince of Wales, and most of the nobility would be gathered in one place. They rented a cellar underneath the Parliament building and filled it with 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to level the entire building and kill everyone in and around it. They planned to kidnap James's daughter, Elizabeth, and install her as a Catholic queen under their control. It was basically a plan to decapitate the entire English government in one explosion. Guy Fawkes, who has become the face of the plot, wasn't actually the leader. He was the explosives expert, a soldier who'd fought in the Spanish Netherlands and knew how to handle gunpowder. He was caught in the cellar on the night of November 4th, guarding the barrels, ready to light the fuse, under torture. The torture was severe. You can still see his signatures deteriorating from the first interrogation, later ones as his hands were progressively broken. Fawkes revealed his co-conspirators. 8 of the plotters were executed in January 1606 by being hanged, drawn and quartered, one of the most brutal execution methods ever devised. The gunpowder plot failed, but it had enormous consequences. It intensified anti-Catholic feeling in England for centuries. November 5th became a national holiday, Guy Fawkes Night, celebrated with bonfires and fireworks where people burned effigies of Guy Fawkes. The famous rhyme, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot kept the memory alive. And it confirmed for many Protestants that Catholics were inherently disloyal, violent and dangerous. This prejudice would shape English and Scottish politics for hundreds of years. James himself was shaken by the plot, but also saw it as proof of divine favour. God had saved him from the... He commissioned the King James Bible, published in 1611, partly as a statement of Protestant unity and strength. That translation would become the most influential English Bible ever produced, shaping English language and literature for centuries. Think about that. The same king who sparked witch trials because of wedding day storms also gave us one of the most beautiful pieces of English prose ever written. History is complicated. Anne of Denmark died in 1619 at age 44, probably from dropsy and other complications. James was reportedly grief-stricken despite their distant relationship. He wore mourning clothes and organized an elaborate funeral. Whatever tensions had existed between them, they'd been partners for 30 years, raised children together, navigated incredible political challenges together. James died in 1625, and the throne passed to their son Charles, who would have a disastrous reign ending in civil war and his own execution in 1649. But that's another story. What matters for our narrative is that James and Anne's marriage created the political framework that still exists today. The United Kingdom, as we know it, traces back to their union and the union of the crowns in 1603. So what's the lesson here? What do we take from James and Anne's story? First, personal gestures matter in politics. James sailing through a storm to meet Anne created a narrative of romantic devotion that served him well, even if the marriage itself was functional rather than passionate. That story made him seem bold, decisive, worthy of respect. Second, religious tolerance is difficult but necessary. James's inability to satisfy Catholic subjects while maintaining Protestant support created tensions that nearly killed him and poisoned political discourse for generations. Third, uniting kingdoms is harder than it looks. You can give them the same monarch, but that doesn't make them the same nation. Full political union took another century, and even today. Scotland maintains a distinct identity and debates independence. And there's something else, the witch trials. James's paranoia about storms and witches seems ridiculous to us now, but it shows how even intelligent, educated people can be led to terrible injustices by fear and superstition. James was a brilliant scholar. He wrote books on political theory and theology, but he also tortured innocent people because he believed they controlled the weather. That's a sobering reminder that intelligence doesn't prevent cruelty, and education doesn't guarantee wisdom. As you let sleep wash over you tonight, think about young James sailing through dangerous waters to meet a bride he'd never seen, beginning a partnership that would reshape Britain. Think about the women tortured and killed because storms were blamed on witchcraft rather than nature. Think about the conspirators in a cellar, surrounded by barrels of gunpowder, convinced they were doing God's work by planning mass murder. And think about how one marriage created the political entity that would eventually become one of the most powerful empires in history, spreading English language and culture across the globe with all the complexity that entails. But not all royal marriages were about uniting kingdoms or creating empires. Some were about pure, naked power, keeping control, maintaining dominance, eliminating rivals. We're heading south now to the sun-drenched chaos of 14th century Naples, where a queen ruled alone, married 4 times, was accused of murdering one husband, and spent 40 years outmaneuvering popes, rival claimants, and would-be conquerors. Joanna I of Naples was one of the most controversial figures in medieval history, either a capable ruler navigating impossible circumstances or a murderous schemer who slept her way through 4 marriages. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but her story is absolutely wild. That's coming up next, so stay with me. They found the body on the terrace, strangled with a cord, then thrown from the balcony to make it look like an accident. He was 17 years old, a prince, a husband, and by all accounts, one of the most hated men in Naples. His name was Andrew of Hungary, and he'd been married to Queen Joanna I for just 3 years. On the night of September 18, 1345, he was murdered, possibly with his wife's knowledge, probably with her approval, maybe even by her direct order. We'll never know for certain, but here's what we do know. Joanna would marry 3 more times after that night, rule Naples for almost 40 years, survive wars, papal accusations, and multiple attempts to overthrow her, and die at age 56, murdered by her own cousin. This is the story of a woman who used marriage not to unite kingdoms but to maintain power, and who paid the ultimate price when her final marriage choice proved disastrous. Let's start at the beginning, because Joanna's situation was nearly impossible from the moment she was. She arrived in 1326 as the granddaughter of King Robert of Naples, called Robert the Wise. Naples at this time was one of the most prosperous kingdoms in Europe, controlling southern Italy and Sicily, with wealth from Mediterranean trade, cultural sophistication, and political importance. But Robert had a problem with succession. His son Charles had died young, leaving behind 2 daughters, Joanna and her younger sister, Maria. Medieval Europe wasn't great with queens ruling in their own right, but Robert had no male heirs. So he decided Joanna would inherit the throne when he died. But Robert knew that Naples, surrounded by ambitious neighbors and filled with fractious nobles, would never accept a young queen ruling alone. She needed a husband, someone who could command armies, but not someone so powerful that he'd overshadow her. Robert chose Andrew, the 2nd son of the King of Hungary. Andrew was Joanna's cousin, and he was about the same age as her. They were betrothed as children and married in 1343 when Joanna was 17. It seemed like a reasonable solution. Except Andrew was terrible. Historical sources are remarkably consistent on this point. He was arrogant, cruel, stupid, and obsessed with being declared King of Naples in his own right, not just the Queen's consort. He surrounded himself with Hungarian advisors who treated the Neapolitan nobility with contempt. He made no effort to learn Italian customs or win support from local power brokers. And he apparently treated Joanna badly. There are hints in contemporary sources of physical abuse, though the evidence isn't conclusive. Joanna, meanwhile, was showing real political intelligence. She patronized scholars and artists, maintained relationships with important noble families, and tried to navigate the incredibly complex politics of southern Italy. But Andrew undermined her at every turn, demanding that he be crowned co-ruler, that documents be issued in his name first, that he receive same honors as Joanna. The Hungarian faction at court supported him, while the Neapolitan nobility increasingly despised him. And then there was the matter of Joanna's pregnancy. In 1344, she gave birth to a son, Charles Martel. There were immediate rumors that Andrew wasn't the father, that Joanna had taken a lover, possibly Louis of Taranto, one of her cousins and a powerful nobleman. Whether these rumors were true or just political slander, we don't know. But they circulated widely, and they enraged Andrew and his Hungarian supporters even more. The situation was becoming untenable. Andrew demanded that Pope Clement VI crown him King of Naples. The Pope, who technically had authority over Naples as a papal fief, hesitated. He sent representatives to investigate, to interview Joanna and the Neapolitan nobility. What they found was a kingdom on the brink of civil war, split between Hungarian and Neapolitan factions, with Andrew at the center of the conflict. On the night of September 18th, 1345, Joanna, Andrew and their court were staying at a castle in Aversa, not far from Naples. According to the official investigation that followed, Andrew left Joanna's chamber late that night to walk on a terrace. Several men attacked him there, strangled him with a silk cord, and threw his body from the terrace to the courtyard below. The murder was quickly discovered, but the killers had vanished. The question that has haunted historians for nearly 700 years is simple. Did Joanna order it? The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The murderers were never caught, which suggests high-level protection. They had access to the castle and knew Andrew's movements, which suggests inside information. And Joanna's behavior afterward was suspicious. She didn't mourn publicly, she didn't pursue the investigation vigorously, and within months she had married Louis of Taranto, the man rumored to be her lover. Andrew's brother, Louis of Hungary, believed Joanna was guilty. He invaded Naples in 1348 seeking revenge. Joanna and Louis of Taranto fled to Provence, then travelled to Avignon, where the Pope resided, seeking his protection and attempting to clear her name. Pope Clement interviewed her personally, examined the evidence, and ultimately declared her innocent. Whether he believed it or was making a political calculation to prevent further chaos, we'll never know. But with papal backing, Joanna was able to return to Naples and reclaim her throne once the Hungarian invasion eventually petered out. So here's where marriage becomes Joanna's primary political tool. Over the next 37 years, she would marry 3 more times, each marriage serving a different strategic purpose. Her second marriage, to Louis of Taranto in 1346, was about consolidating power. Louis was a capable military commander from a powerful local family. Together they fought off the Hungarian invasion and re-established royal authority. Louis and Joanna ruled jointly until his death in 1362 from what was probably malaria or plague. By all accounts, this marriage worked. They were partners. They cooperated politically. And if Louis sometimes resented being subordinate to his wife, he was smart enough not to push the issue too hard. After Louis's death, Joanna waited 2 years before marrying again. Her third husband was James IV of Majorca, a king without a kingdom. He'd lost Majorca to Aragon and was living in exile. Why would Joanna marry a landless king? Because she needed an alliance against Aragon, which was encroaching on Naples' territory. James brought military expertise and connections to enemies of Aragon. But the marriage was a disaster. James was incompetent as a military commander, unpopular with the Neapolitan nobility, and constantly scheming to use Joanna's resources to reconquer Majorca for himself, rather than defending Naples. After 2 years, Joanna had their marriage annulled in 1370. She paid James off with lands and titles and sent him away. It's one of the few examples in medieval history of a queen divorcing a king for political convenience. Joanna's fourth and final marriage in 1376 was to Otto of Brunswick, who was in his 20s while Joanna was 50. This was purely about succession. Joanna had no surviving children, and she needed an heir to prevent civil war after her death. Otto was young, healthy, and from a respectable German family, but he was also a disaster. Contemporary sources describe him as violent, possibly mentally unstable, obsessed with tournaments and military glory, but incompetent at actual warfare. He alienated the nobility, squandered resources, and apparently tried to assert authority over Joanna herself. After 3 years, she had him arrested, declared insane, and imprisoned. He would die in prison in 1398, long after Joanna herself was dead. Now, you might be thinking, this woman went through 4 husbands, was accused of murdering the first, divorced the third, imprisoned the... How did she maintain power for 40 years? The answer is that Joanna was genuinely skilled at the most important part of medieval rulership, balancing competing factions. Naples was a complicated kingdom with French cultural influence, Italian political traditions, proximity to the Papal States, and constant pressure from Aragon, Hungary, and other regional powers. A successful ruler needed to play these forces against each other while maintaining enough military and economic strength to remain independent. Joanna did this brilliantly. She cultivated relationships with multiple popes over her reign, sometimes supporting one papal claimant over another during the Western Schism, when there were competing popes. She granted privileges to the nobility where necessary but also maintained royal authority. She patronized the arts and learning. Naples under Joanna was a center of culture, attracting scholars, poets, and artists. Francesco Petrarca, one of the greatest poets of the age, wrote about Joanna with admiration. Boccaccio dedicated works to her. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a sophisticated, intelligent ruler who understood that power required more than military force. But here's where things get complicated morally. Joanna's reign wasn't bloodless. She suppressed rebellions ruthlessly. She manipulated papal politics for her own advantage. And that question about Andrew's murder never fully went away. Even if she didn't directly order it, she certainly benefited from it, and her failure to pursue the killers aggressively suggests at least complicity. Can we admire her political skill while acknowledging that she might have been involved in her husband's murder? History is full of these uncomfortable questions. The Great Schism, which began in 1378, would ultimately destroy Joanna. This was the crisis when the Catholic Church split, with one pope in Rome and another in Avignon, each claiming to be the legitimate successor to Saint Peter, European. Kingdoms had to choose sides, and their choice had enormous political implications. Joanna initially supported the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, partly because her family had historical ties to France and Provence. But Charles of Durazzo, Joanna's cousin and a distant heir to Naples, supported the Roman Pope, Urban VI. Urban, eager for political support, declared that Charles should be king of Naples instead of Joanna. This was the papal blessing Charles needed. He invaded Naples in 1381 with an army, claiming he was the rightful ruler. Joanna, now 55 years old, tried to resist, but she'd alienated too many people over the years. The nobility didn't rally to her defense. Her fourth husband, Otto, was useless. Her adopted heir, Louis I of Anjou, was far away and couldn't help. Charles captured Joanna in 1381 and imprisoned her in a castle. For several months he kept her alive, possibly hoping she'd legitimize his rule by abdicating in his favor. She refused. So, in May or July 1382, the exact date is uncertain, Charles had her murdered. Some sources say she was strangled, others say she was smothered with pillows. Her body was quietly buried, and Charles became king of Naples. It was a brutal end for a woman who had survived so much. But here's the thing about Joanna. Her legacy is genuinely unclear. Medieval chroniclers portrayed her either as a murderous schemer who slept her way through 4 marriages, or as a capable ruler navigating impossible circumstances in a man's world. Modern historians are divided too. Some see her as an early example of effective female rulership, a woman who used the tools available to her, marriage, political alliance, cultural patronage, to maintain power in a hostile environment. Others see her as morally compromised, willing to murder, manipulate, and betray to keep her throne. Maybe the truth is that she was both. Joanna lived in a time when political power was tied to violence, when rulers were expected to be ruthless, when survival meant making terrible choices. Male rulers who did what Joanna did, strategic marriages, eliminating rivals, suppressing rebellions, are often celebrated as strong and decisive. When a woman does the same things, she's called a schemer or worse. That double standard is worth thinking about. But there's something else about Joanna's story that fascinates me. She ruled alone. Yes, she married multiple times, but none of her husbands ever fully co-ruled with her. She was always the queen. They were always consorts or co-rulers subordinate to her. In an age when women weren't supposed to rule at all, Joanna insisted on her own authority for 40 years. That took extraordinary strength, intelligence, and yes, probably ruthlessness. She wasn't a saint, but she also wasn't the monster some chroniclers portrayed. As your breathing deepens and your mind drifts towards sleep, think about Joanna at 16, inheriting a kingdom she didn't ask for, married to a man she probably didn't love, and maybe hated, trying to figure out how to rule in a world that didn't believe women could lead. Think about the choices she made, some wise, some terrible, all calculated for survival. Think about how we judge powerful women differently than powerful men, even today, 700 years later. And think about how lonely it must have been, going through 4 marriages, none of them providing the partnership and support she needed, always calculating, always manipulating, always one wrong move away from losing everything, which in the end she did. But not every royal marriage was about grim political calculation and survival. Sometimes, rarely, a marriage was built on genuine love and mutual respect, and that marriage created something beautiful that outlasted both people. We're traveling east again to the Mughal Empire in India to meet a prince and a princess whose love story would inspire one of the most magnificent buildings ever constructed. Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal loved each other genuinely deeply for 19 years and 14 children. And when she died giving birth to their last child, Shah Jahan's grief was so profound that he built the Taj Mahal as her tomb, a monument so beautiful that it's become a symbol of eternal love. But this love story has a darker side too, because building that monument nearly bankrupted the empire, and Shah Jahan's obsession with architectural beauty may have contributed to the empire's decline. That remarkable story awaits us next. They say when she died, his hair turned white overnight. Whether that's literally true or poetic exaggeration, we'll never know. But what we do know is this: when Mumtaz Mahal died in 1631 after giving birth to their 14th child, Emperor Shah Jahan of the Mughal Empire entered a period of mourning so profound, so all-consuming that it changed him completely. For 2 years he wore no bright colors, listened to no music, attended no celebrations. He aged visibly, dramatically, and then he commissioned something extraordinary. A tomb so magnificent, so perfectly beautiful that it would take 22 years and over 20,000 workers to complete. Today we call it the Taj Mahal, and it's recognized as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. But here's what most people don't know about this famous love story. Building the Taj Mahal may have helped destroy the Mughal Empire. This is what happens when personal grief becomes national policy, when love becomes obsession, when a monument to one woman costs more than feeding millions. Let's go back to the beginning, because Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal's story actually started as a fairy tale. The year was 1607. Prince Khurram, that was Shah Jahan's name before he became emperor, was 15 years old, walking through the Royal Meena Bazaar, an annual festival where royal women could shop and socialize without full veils. And there he saw Arjumand Banu Begum, later known as Mumtaz Mahal, who was 14. According to Court Chronicles, it was love at first sight. Khurram went to his father, Emperor Jahangir, and begged for permission to marry her. But royal marriages in the Mughal Empire were complicated. Khurram had to wait 5 years before the wedding could take place. During that time, he was married to 2 other women for political reasons, Persian princesses who brought important alliances. This was completely normal for Mughal royalty. Polygamy was accepted, and political marriages were expected. But when Khurram finally married Mumtaz in 1612, something unusual happened. Despite having other wives, Mumtaz became his absolute favorite, his constant companion, his trusted advisor. Other wives existed in name only. Mumtaz was his true partner. Contemporary accounts describe Mumtaz as beautiful, yes, but more importantly as intelligent and compassionate. She advised Khurram on political matters. She accompanied him on military campaigns, which was highly unusual. Most royal wives stayed in the harem while their husbands went to war. But Mumtaz traveled with Khurram, living in tents on campaign, sharing the hardships of military life. Court historians wrote that the emperor sought her counsel on important decisions, that she influenced appointments and policies, that she used her position to advocate for the poor and dispossessed. They had 14 children together over 19 years of marriage, 14 pregnancies. Think about that for a moment. In an era when childbirth was incredibly dangerous, when many women died giving birth and even more children died in infancy, Mumtaz survived 13 births. 7 of their children lived to adulthood, which was actually a good survival rate for the time, but that still means 7 children died as infants or young children. The grief of losing those children, the physical toll of so many pregnancies, it must have been enormous. In 1628, Khurram became emperor after his father Jahangir died, taking the title Shah Jahan, which means King of the World, and Mumtaz became his empress, receiving the title Mumtaz Mahal, meaning Jewel of the Palace. Together they ruled one of the richest empires on earth. The Mughal Empire in the early 17th century controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, with a population of around 100 million people and wealth that made it one of the most prosperous regions in the world. Shah Jahan's court was legendary for its luxury, elaborate ceremonies, priceless jewels, artistic patronage on a massive scale. But then came June 17, 1631. Shah Jahan was on a military campaign in Berhampur in central India, and Mumtaz had accompanied him, heavily pregnant with their 14th child. She went into labor and something went wrong. Maybe it was a hemorrhage, maybe a breech birth, maybe infection. We don't know the medical details. What we know is that she gave birth to a daughter, Goharara Begum, and then hours later, Mumtaz died. She was 38 years old. Shah Jahan was devastated. According to court chronicles, he locked himself in his chambers for 8 days, refusing to see anyone. When he finally emerged, courtiers were shocked at his appearance. His beard had streaks of white that hadn't been there before. His face was aged, his posture defeated. For 2 years, the most powerful emperor in the world wore white mourning clothes instead of the rich colors and jewels expected of a Mughal ruler. He banned music and celebrations throughout the court. He gave up wearing perfume and jewelry. The man who had been known for his love of beauty and luxury became a figure of grief. But grief for an emperor can be expressed on a scale ordinary people can't imagine. Shah Jahan decided to build a tomb for Mumtaz that would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not just a mausoleum, but a symbol of eternal love, a physical manifestation of his devotion, something so beautiful that everyone who saw it would understand the depth of his loss. The Taj Mahal took 22 years to build, from 1632 to 1653. Shah Jahan brought in the best architects, craftsmen, and artisans from across the empire and beyond, master masons from Persia, marble carvers from Italy, calligraphers from Syria, specialists in pietra dura, inlay work from Central Asia. Over 20,000 workers labored on the project at its peak. The main structure is built from white marble quarried from Makrana in Rajasthan, transported over 300 kilometers using a fleet of over 1,000 elephants. The design is based on perfect symmetry and Islamic architectural principles. The main dome rises to about 73 meters, roughly as tall as a modern 20-story building. 4 minarets frame the main structure, each over 40 meters tall. The entire complex sits on the banks of the Yamuna River with extensive gardens designed to represent paradise as described in Islamic texts. Inside the mausoleum, the walls are decorated with semi-precious stones jasper, jade, turquoise, lapis lazuli, sapphires, carnelian arranged in intricate floral patterns. Calligraphy from the Quran adorns the walls, growing slightly larger as it ascends so that from the ground every letter appears the same size. It's a masterpiece of optical design. And it was obscenely expensive. Historians estimate the Taj Mahal cost approximately 32 million rupees to build, which in today's currency would be somewhere between 800 million and $1 billion. But that raw number doesn't capture the true cost, because those resources weren't being used for anything else. While Shah Jahan was pouring enormous wealth into building a tomb, the empire faced other challenges: maintaining military forces, managing provinces, dealing with famines and disease outbreaks. Here's where the love story takes on a darker tone. Shah Jahan's obsession with building didn't stop with the Taj Mahal. He also rebuilt sections of Agra Fort in white marble, constructed the Red Fort Inn. Delhi commissioned the Jama Masjid Mosque and initiated other major architectural projects. His reign became known for its architectural achievements, the apex of Mughal architecture. But this came at an enormous financial cost. The empire's treasury was drained. Taxes on the peasantry increased to fund these projects. Agricultural regions suffered as resources were diverted to construction. And then came the wars of succession. Shah Jahan had 4 sons who survived to adulthood, and they all wanted to be emperor. In 1657, Shah Jahan fell seriously ill, and his sons immediately began fighting each other for control of the empire. The third son, Aurangzeb, was the most ruthless. He defeated his brothers, executing 2 of them, Dara Shikoh and Murad Baksha, and imprisoning Shah Jahan himself. Shah Jahan spent the last 8 years of his life under house arrest in Agra Fort, in a tower with a window that looked out across the river to the Taj Mahal. Every day he could see the monument he'd built to his beloved wife, the physical embodiment of his grief and love. Imagine that, imprisoned by your own son, everything taken from you, able only to gaze at the tomb of the woman you loved more than anything. He died in January 1666 at age 74 and was buried beside Mumtaz in the Taj Mahal, the only asymmetrical element in the entire structure. Aurangzeb would rule for nearly 50 years, but his reign was marked by constant warfare, religious intolerance, and imperial overextension. By the time he died in 1707, the Mughal Empire was in serious decline. Within 50 years, it would be unable to resist British colonization. There are many reasons for the empire's fall. Aurangzeb's policies, European military technology, internal rebellions, economic changes, but Shah Jahan's financial mismanagement, his obsession with grand building projects at the expense of practical governance, certainly contributed to weakening the empire. So what are we supposed to make of this story? On one hand, we have the Taj Mahal, arguably the most beautiful building in the world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by millions of people every year, a testament to human artistic achievement. On the other hand, we have an empire weakened by excessive spending, peasants taxed to fund a monument to one woman, resources squandered on beauty while practical needs went unmet. Can we appreciate the Taj Mahal's beauty while acknowledging the cost? I think we have to. The artisans who created it poured incredible skill and dedication into every detail. The architectural innovations influenced building design across South Asia. The cultural legacy is immeasurable. But we should also remember that great monuments are always built on someone's labor, someone's sacrifice, someone's tax burden. The workers who spent decades carving marble, the peasants who paid increased taxes, the elephants that died transporting stone, they were all part of creating this symbol of love. There's also something a bit troubling about how we romanticize the Taj Mahal story. He loved her so much he built the most beautiful building in the world. It sounds wonderful. But love expressed through enormous expenditure, while ordinary people suffer, that's less romantic. It's the same critique we might make of a modern billionaire who builds a massive vanity project instead of using resources to solve practical problems. The scale is different, but the principle is similar. And yet, standing in front of the Taj Mahal to Diane, I hope you get to see it someday. If you haven't, you can't help but be moved. The proportions are perfect. The white marble changes color as the sun moves across the sky, pink at dawn, gleaming white at noon, golden at sunset. The reflection in the pools creates a sense of infinite space. The Pietra Dura work is so fine that you can barely feel the seams between stones. It's not just beautiful, it's transcendent. It reaches for something beyond practical. Human concerns, something about love, loss, memory, eternity. Maybe that's what great art does. It takes personal emotion, even personal obsession, and transforms it into something universal. Shah Jahan's grief was specific to him and Mumtaz. But the Taj Mahal speaks to anyone who's ever loved someone, lost someone, wanted to create something lasting to say, this person mattered, this love was real, this is worth remembering. In that sense, the Taj Mahal succeeded. Nobody remembers the political decisions of Shah Jahan's reign, or the military campaigns, or the administrative reforms. But everyone knows the Taj Mahal. Mumtaz Mahal's memory has been preserved more thoroughly than almost any other historical figures. There's an irony here too. Mumtaz was known in her lifetime for compassion, for advocating for the poor, for using her influence to help the vulnerable. And Shah Jahan honored her memory by building something that required immense resources and labor, that diverted wealth. From social needs to architectural glory. Would Mumtaz have wanted that? We can't know, but it's worth thinking about. Sometimes the way we honor people says more about us than about them. As you sink into sleep tonight, picture the Taj Mahal at dawn. Mist rising from the Yamuna River, the white marble just beginning to catch the light, turning from grey to pink to gold. Picture Shah Jahan in his tower window, old and imprisoned, looking across the river every morning at the monument to his lost love. Picture Mumtaz, who never asked for any of this, who probably just wanted to be with her husband and children, whose greatest tragedy wasn't dying but becoming a symbol, a metaphor rather than remaining a person. Love and obsession, grief and beauty, personal devotion and public responsibility there, all tangled together in this story, impossible to separate. We've been journeying through marriages that shaped empires, broke churches, started wars, and built monuments. But now, going to meet someone who used marriage more strategically than almost anyone in history, not once or twice, but across 4 different husbands, 2 different kingdoms, and a lifetime of political maneuvering that most male rulers would envy. Eleanor of Aquitaine married 2 kings, went on crusade, raised 10 children, spent 16 years in prison, and lived to age 82, outlasting almost everyone who tried to control her. She was the most powerful woman of the 12th century, and her marriages didn't just change history, they reshaped the map of Europe and set the stage for centuries of conflict between England and France. That extraordinary story is coming up next. Consider for a moment the sheer audacity of this. You're the richest woman in Europe. You've been married to the King of France for 15 years. You've given him 2 daughters. You've even gone on crusade with him to Jerusalem. And then you get your marriage annulled, walk away with all your lands intact. 8 weeks later, 8 weeks, you marry the man who will become King of England, creating an empire that makes your ex-husband look weak. That's Eleanor of Aquitaine. She didn't just survive 2 royal marriages, she dominated them both. Outlived both husbands, raised 10 children including 2 kings and 1 legendary crusader, spent 16 years in prison, and then emerged to rule England as Queen Mother at age 67. She lived to be 82 in an age when most people didn't make it past 40. This is the story of the woman who refused to be controlled by anyone, who turned marriage into a weapon of political warfare, and who shaped the destiny of 2 kingdoms through sheer force of will. Let's start with what Eleanor brought to the table. Because this wasn't just some nobleman's daughter looking for a good match. Eleanor was born around 1122 as the eldest daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine. And Aquitaine wasn't just any duchy. It was enormous, covering roughly a quarter of what's now France, stretching from the Loire River down to the Pyrenees Mountains. It included Poitiers, Bordeaux, Gascony, and some of the richest wine-producing land in Europe. When Eleanor's father and younger brother both died in 1137, Eleanor inherited everything. At age 15, she became the Duchess of Aquitaine, in her own right one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in all of Europe, male or female. That kind of wealth and territory made you politically crucial. King Louis VI of France immediately recognized the opportunity. His son, also named Louis, needed to marry Eleanor immediately before some other noble family could snatch her up. The marriage was arranged with stunning speed. Eleanor's father died in April 1137, and by July, Eleanor and young Louis were married in Bordeaux. Within days, Louis VI died. And suddenly Eleanor's new husband was Louis VII, King of France. Eleanor had gone from Duchess to Queen in a matter of months. The marriage started. Well enough, Louis was pious, serious, bookish. He'd actually been training for the church before his older brother died and made him heir to the throne. Eleanor was sophisticated, cultured, loved poetry and music and courtly society. She'd been raised in the cosmopolitan court of Aquitaine, which was known throughout Europe as a center of troubadour culture, where poets sang of courtly love and noble ladies were celebrated rather than hidden away. The clash of styles between Eleanor and Louis was immediate and probably entertaining to watch. He wanted to be a monk king. She wanted to host elaborate courts filled with artists and intellectuals. But the real crisis came in 1145, when Louis, under pressure from the Pope, launched an attack on the Count of Champagne. During this campaign, French soldiers burned a church in Vitry with hundreds of civilians inside. The massacre haunted Louis. He became increasingly guilt-ridden and religious. Meanwhile, Eleanor had given him two daughters, Marie in 1145 and Alix in 1150, but no sons. The lack of a male heir was becoming politically dangerous. Then came the Second Crusade, proclaimed in 1146. Louis, desperate to atone for the Vitry massacre and secure divine favor for a male heir, announced he would lead French forces to the Holy Land, and Eleanor decided to go with him. This was highly unusual. Queens didn't typically accompany crusading armies, but Eleanor insisted, and she brought with her a substantial force of knights from Aquitaine. Some sources say she even brought hundreds of ladies-in-waiting, turning the crusade into a kind of mobile court. Medieval chroniclers, who generally disapproved of women in military campaigns, had a field day criticizing this. The crusade was a disaster. The French army suffered terrible losses crossing Anatolia. When they finally reached Antioch in 1148, Eleanor's uncle Raymond was the ruler there, and he welcomed them warmly, too warmly. According to rumors that, immediately started circulating, the story spread that Eleanor and Raymond were having an affair, that they were spending too much time together, that their relationship was inappropriate. Whether this was true or just malicious gossip, we'll never know. What we do know is that Louis and Eleanor had a massive fight in Antioch. Raymond wanted the crusade to attack specific Muslim positions in the area. Louis wanted to go to Jerusalem. Eleanor sided with her uncle. Louis forcibly removed her from Antioch and dragged her to Jerusalem with him. The crusade ended in complete failure. The siege of Damascus was a catastrophe. Thousands died, and the whole expedition achieved nothing except weakening the Crusader states and embarrassing European Christendom. Louis and Eleanor returned to France in 1149, their marriage essentially destroyed. They'd been apart for significant portions of the crusade. The rumors about Eleanor and Raymond had poisoned their relationship, and there was still no son. In 1152, they obtained an annulment. The stated reason was consanguinity. They were related within the fourth degree, distant cousins, and technically needed a papal dispensation for their marriage to be valid. Never mind that they'd been married for 15 years and had two daughters. The real reason was that the marriage wasn't working. Eleanor hadn't produced a male heir, and both parties wanted out. Eleanor walked away with her daughters, her lands, and her title. The Duchess of Aquitaine was single again, and this is where Eleanor made the most audacious political move of the 12th century. On May 18, 1152, just 8 weeks after her annulment, she married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. Henry was 19 years old. Eleanor was about 30. He was athletic, energetic, fiercely intelligent, and ambitious beyond measure. And through his mother, he had a strong claim to the English throne, which was currently held by King Stephen in a contested succession. Do you realize what this marriage meant? Eleanor's Aquitaine plus Henry's Normandy, Anjou, and Maine created the Angevin Empire, controlling more of France than the French king did. Louis VII must have been furious. His ex-wife had just created a rival power bloc that dwarfed his own territory. And when Henry became King Henry II of England in 1154, Eleanor became Queen of England as well as Duchess of Aquitaine. She'd traded up dramatically. Eleanor and Henry's marriage was passionate, political, and ultimately explosive. They had 8 children together. William, who died young Henry, the young King Matilda. Richard, who would become Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, Eleanor, Joan, and John, who would become King John. That's 10 children total between her 2 marriages, 10 pregnancies in medieval times. The physical toll alone must have been extraordinary. For about 15 years, Eleanor and Henry worked well together. She ruled Aquitaine effectively, established her court at Poitiers, which became a legendary center of courtly love culture. She traveled constantly, managing her territories, raising her children, supporting Henry's rule. Henry controlled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. They were arguably the most powerful couple in Europe. But Henry had a fatal flaw. He couldn't keep his promises to his sons, and he wouldn't stay faithful to Eleanor. The infidelity was expected. Medieval kings had mistresses, but Henry's relationship with Rosamund Clifford was particularly public and humiliating to Eleanor. And more importantly, Henry kept promising his sons territories and authority, then changing his mind, keeping power concentrated in his own hands. His sons grew increasingly frustrated. In 1173, Eleanor's sons Henry, the young king, Richard and Geoffrey rebelled against their father, and Eleanor supported them. This was extraordinary. A queen supporting her sons in rebellion against her husband, the king. Henry II was furious and betrayed. The rebellion failed. He had Eleanor arrested. For the next 16 years, Eleanor was held in various castles in England, essentially a prisoner. She wasn't in a dungeon in chains, but she wasn't free. She could receive visitors, have servants, but she couldn't leave without Henry's permission, which he never granted. Imagine being one of the most powerful women in Europe, accustomed to ruling vast territories and commanding courts. And suddenly you're confined to a few rooms in a castle with nothing to do but wait. She was in her early 50s when imprisoned, in her late 60s when finally released. Henry II died in 1189, and everything changed. Eleanor's son Richard became King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. One of Richard's first acts was releasing his mother. And Eleanor, at age 67, didn't retire to a convent or fade into quiet old age. She became regent of England while Richard went on the Third Crusade. She ruled effectively, managing finances, diplomacy and political crises. When Richard was captured and held for ransom on his way back from Crusade, Eleanor personally negotiated for his release and raised the enormous sum demanded. When Richard died in 1199 from an infected arrow wound, Eleanor supported her youngest son John's claim to the English throne over her grandson Arthur. John is famous as one of England's worst kings. He lost most of the French territories, was forced to sign Magna Carta, alienated everyone. But Eleanor stayed loyal to him until her death in 1204 at age 82. Think about the timeline of Eleanor's life. She was born when Henry I ruled England. She died when John was king. She'd been queen to 2 different kings in 2 different countries. She'd raised 5 sons and 5 daughters, outlived most of them. She'd been on crusade, been imprisoned, been regent. She'd gone from the most powerful woman in France to the most powerful woman in England, to a prisoner, to a power behind the throne. Through it all, she'd maintained her identity, her lands, and her influence. Here's what's remarkable about Eleanor's story compared to other royal women we've discussed. She was never defined solely by her relationships to men. Yes, she was married to Louis and then Henry. Yes, she was mother to kings. But Eleanor was always fundamentally the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. Her lands didn't pass to her husbands, they remained hers. When she left Louis, she took Aquitaine with her. When Henry imprisoned her, he couldn't take Aquitaine away. That independent power base made her different from most medieval queens who existed only through their husband's authority. Eleanor's legacy is complicated. The Angevin Empire she helped create by marrying Henry ultimately collapsed. The territories were lost to France over the next century. But her children and grandchildren sat on thrones across Europe. Her patronage of courtly love culture influenced European literature for centuries. The idea of romantic love as we understand it today owes something to the troubadour culture Eleanor promoted. And she proved that a medieval woman could wield real political power, could survive and thrive through multiple regimes, could be more than just a passive pawn in male politics. Was she manipulative? Absolutely. Did she use people, including her own children, for political advantage? Probably. Was she always admirable? Certainly not. But she was also brilliant, resilient, and refused to accept the limitations placed on women in her era. She played the game of medieval politics as well as any man and better than most. As you drift towards sleep, imagine Eleanor at 80 years old, surrounded by chaos, her son John losing territories, nobles rebelling, the empire she helped build crumbling. And yet she's still there, still advising, still managing crises, still refusing to give up. Imagine her looking back across 60 years of political turmoil, 2 kingdoms, 2 husbands, 10 children, triumph and imprisonment and freedom again. What did she think about it all? Did she have regrets? Was she satisfied with what she had accomplished? We'll never know. But she kept fighting until the very end, which tells you something about who Eleanor of Aquitaine was. But we're not done yet. We have 2 more marriages to explore, and they take us to the very end, literally the end. We're going to meet the last emperor of a 1,000-year empire, a man who died defending his city's walls because he couldn't find a bride who would bring him the allies he desperately needed. Constantine XI of Byzantium was married twice and widowed twice. And when his empire was falling, he couldn't find a 3rd wife because no one wanted to ally with a doomed kingdom. His failed marriage negotiations perfectly symbolize Byzantium's isolation and inevitable collapse. And then we'll close with something completely different, a modern fairy tale that actually happened when a Hollywood movie star married a prince and saved a country. That final chapter awaits, sometimes the ones that do. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, died alone on the walls of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, fighting the Ottoman armies that were pouring through the breached defenses of his city. He was 48 years old, unmarried at the time of his death, and desperate for an alliance that might have saved his empire. He had been married twice before. Both wives had died young, leaving him without heirs and without the foreign support a third marriage might have brought. For years before the final siege, Constantine had been frantically searching for a new bride, sending proposals across Europe, trying to find anyone who would marry him and bring with them an alliance strong enough to save Byzantium. Every proposal was rejected. No one wanted to marry the emperor of a dying empire. This is the tragedy of Constantine XI. Not just that he lost his empire, but that his desperate search for a saving marriage perfectly symbolized Byzantium's utter isolation in its final years. Let's understand what Constantine inherited, because his situation was already hopeless before he even became emperor. The Byzantine Empire, which had once controlled the entire Mediterranean, which had been the wealthiest and most powerful state in Europe for centuries, had been reduced to basically just Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories. The Ottoman Turks surrounded them on all sides. The empire had no money, no significant military force, and no real allies. Constantinople's population had dropped from hundreds of thousands in its glory days to maybe 50,000 by the 1440s. Entire neighborhoods inside the city walls were abandoned, left to decay. The great city that had held off sieges for 1,000 years was now a shadow of itself, its famous walls still standing, but with fewer and fewer defenders to man them. Constantine became emperor in 1449 after his brother John VIII died childless. Constantine was the next in line, the best hope the Byzantines had, a capable military commander who'd already proven himself in battle. But he was also a widower, 44 years old, with no children and no obvious heir. His first marriage had been to Theodora Tocco, an Italian noblewoman, in 1428. She brought some alliance with Italian states, which Byzantium desperately needed since Italy was the only part of Europe that still maintained significant trade and diplomatic relations with Constantinople. But Theodora died in 1430 after just 2 years of marriage, possibly from plague, no children. Constantine's second marriage in 1440 to Caterina Gattilusio was even more tragic. Caterina was from a Genoese family that controlled the island of Lesbos. Again, this was about securing Italian and Genoese support. But Caterina died just months after the wedding, possibly from plague as well, or perhaps childbirth complications. The records aren't clear. Again, no children, 2 wives, 2 deaths, no heirs, no lasting alliances. So when Constantine became emperor in 1449, finding a third wife wasn't just about personal happiness or producing an heir. It was literally about survival. A marriage to the right woman could bring military aid, financial support, or at least diplomatic recognition from Western powers. Without that support, Constantinople was doomed. Everyone knew it. The question was whether Constantine could find someone willing to bet on Byzantium's survival. He tried everywhere. One of his first proposals went to Mara Branković, a Serbian princess. But here's the complication. Mara was the widow of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II. She'd been married to the father of Mehmed II, who was now besieging Constantinople. Mara was living in comfortable retirement, had her own income and estates, and had absolutely no interest in marrying Constantine and getting dragged back into the political chaos she'd escaped. She politely declined. "Can you imagine that conversation? Would you like to marry me and help save my dying empire from the son of your dead husband?" "No, thank you. I'm quite comfortable where I am." Constantine sent proposals to various Italian states, to princesses in Naples, to noble families in Genoa and Venice. The responses were lukewarm at best. Some families expressed interest but demanded impossible concessions, that Byzantium accept full union with the Catholic Church, that Constantine recognize papal authority, that he convert his Orthodox subjects to Catholicism. Constantine was desperate enough to consider some of this, but he also knew that forcing religious union would likely trigger civil unrest in Constantinople. The Orthodox population hated the idea of submitting to Rome. They had a saying, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat." They'd rather be conquered by Muslims than submit to what they saw as Catholic heresy. Constantine even sent proposals to Georgia, to Armenian noble families anywhere that might have a suitable princess. All rejected. The problem was simple. Everyone knew Byzantium was doomed. Marrying Constantine meant tying your family's fortune to an empire that would probably fall within a few years. What father would send his daughter into that situation? What kingdom would commit resources to defending a city that couldn't defend itself? The final desperate proposal went to a Portuguese princess, but that fell through as well when the Portuguese calculated that the distance and the hopelessness of the situation made it a terrible investment. By early 1453, as Mehmed II began assembling his armies for the final siege, Constantine was still unmarried, still without a strong foreign alliance, still isolated. And here's where we need to talk about what the lack of this marriage meant strategically. If Constantine had secured a marriage to, say, a Venetian or Genoese princess, Venice, or Genoa might have felt obligated to send significant military aid, a few thousand well-armed Italian soldiers, a fleet of ships to break the Ottoman naval blockade. That might have been enough to hold Constantinople until the Ottoman army ran out of supplies or was forced to withdraw due to problems elsewhere in their empire. It had happened before. Multiple Ottoman sieges had failed because the city held out long enough. But without that alliance, without that commitment from a major power, Constantinople was on its own. When the siege began in April 1453, the city's defenders numbered maybe 7,000 men, including volunteers from Venice and Genoa, who came individually, but without official backing from their governments. The Ottoman forces numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men, with massive cannons that could pound the ancient walls day after day. The disparity was overwhelming. Constantine knew how this would end. According to chroniclers, in the final days before the walls were breached, he gave a speech to his remaining commanders and soldiers. He talked about the glory of Byzantium, the 1,000 years of Roman tradition they were defending, the faith they were protecting. And then he reportedly said that he would die as emperor of the Romans, that he wouldn't flee, that if this was the end, he would face it with courage. When the walls finally broke on May 29th, Constantine threw off his imperial regalia so that his body wouldn't be identified and desecrated, and he charged into the breach with a sword, fighting alongside common soldiers. He was never seen again. His body was never conclusively identified. The last Roman emperor died anonymously in the chaos of Constantinople's fall. There's something profoundly tragic about Constantine's story when you view it through the lens of marriage and alliance. Every other ruler we've discussed tonight used marriage to build power, create empires, forge alliances. Constantine tried, desperately, to do the same thing, and he failed because no one believed in his cause anymore. His inability to find a wife became a symbol of Byzantium's complete isolation politically, militarily, culturally. The West had written off Constantinople as a lost cause. The Orthodox Christian world couldn't help. Constantine stood alone. But there's also something heroic about his end. He could have fled. He could have taken whatever wealth remained and escaped to Italy or the Greek islands, lived comfortably in exile, claimed to be emperor in absentia like so many deposed rulers before him. Instead, he chose to die defending his city. That means something. That says something about duty, about honor, about refusing to abandon your people even when the cause is hopeless. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is often marked as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing with them ancient Greek texts that had been preserved in Constantinople for centuries. This influx of knowledge helped fuel the Renaissance. The Ottoman conquest also pushed European powers to find new trade routes to Asia, which led directly to the age of exploration – Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan. In a weird way, the fall of Constantinople helped create the modern world. But for Constantine personally, for the people who died in the siege, for the families torn apart when thousands were enslaved after the city fell, these grand historical narratives don't mean much. They lived through a catastrophe. Constantine died trying to prevent it. And part of why he failed was that he couldn't secure the one thing that might have saved his empire, a marriage alliance that would bring real military support. I wonder sometimes what Constantine thought about during the siege. Did he think about his 2 dead wives? Did he wonder what would have happened if they'd lived, if they'd had children, if those children had created ties to Italian families? That might have brought more aid. Did he think about all the rejected marriage proposals, all the doors that had closed in his face? Or was he beyond all that by then, focused only on the immediate crisis, on holding the walls one more day, killing one more Ottoman soldier, buying one more hour for his city? The story of Constantine's failed marriages is a reminder that sometimes No matter how hard you try, no matter how desperate you are, circumstances beyond your control determine your fate. Constantine couldn't make Italian princesses want to marry him. He couldn't make Western powers care about Byzantium's survival. He couldn't turn back the tide of history. All he could do was fight to the end, which he did. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. As your eyes grow heavy and sleep approaches, think about Constantine on those walls, knowing he was defending not just a city but the last remnant of the Roman Empire, that thousand-year legacy we talked about earlier with Sophia Paleologina. Think about how marriage, which had been such a powerful tool for empire building throughout history, failed him completely at the moment he needed it most. Think about the loneliness of being the last emperor of Rome unmarried, without heirs, without strong allies, facing an enemy that vastly outnumbered you, knowing that if you fell, a civilization fell with you. But let's end our journey tonight on a lighter note, shall we? Because we've traveled through a lot of heavy history: murders, wars, empires falling, genetic disasters, religious schisms. Our final story is different. It's recent history within living memory. It's about a genuine fairy tale that actually happened. A Hollywood movie star at the peak of her career who gave it all up to marry a prince and become a real princess. And unlike most of the royal marriages we've discussed, this one actually worked. Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier III of Monaco didn't just have a successful marriage, they transformed a struggling principality into one of the wealthiest, most glamorous places on earth. It's a story of love, pragmatism, Hollywood magic, and how one American woman saved a European monarchy. That perfect ending to our long journey together is just ahead. Imagine this scene. It's April 19th, 1956, and the most beautiful woman in Hollywood is walking down the aisle in a cathedral in Monaco. 30 million people around the world are watching on television, one of the first major events broadcast internationally. She's wearing a dress designed by the head costume designer at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, made from 125 yards of silk and Alençon lace embedded with thousands of tiny pearls. She looks like every fairy tale princess you've ever imagined, and she's about to marry a real prince, give up a movie career at its absolute peak, and transform a struggling European principality into one of the most famous, glamorous places on earth. This is Grace Kelly and her marriage to Prince Rainier III of Monaco is proof that sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tales actually can come true, though they require a lot more pragmatism, sacrifice, and hard work than Disney movies would have you believe. Let's set the stage, because Monaco in 1955 was not the playground of the rich and famous that it is today. It was a tiny principality less than 1 square mile perched on the Mediterranean coast between France and Italy. It had a population of about 20,000 people. The casino was famous, sure, but the country was struggling financially. France was threatening to annex Monaco unless Prince Rainier could produce an heir within a certain time frame. The principality's independence literally depended on Rainier getting married and having children. And Rainier himself, though certainly privileged, was dealing with a difficult situation. He'd inherited a country with debt problems, a constitution that limited his power, and constant pressure from France. Grace Kelly, meanwhile, was at the absolute top of Hollywood. She'd won an Academy Award for Best Actress in 1955 for The Country Girl. She'd starred in 3 Alfred Hitchcock films: Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief, establishing herself as the epitome of sophisticated, elegant beauty. She was 26 years old, earning enormous salaries, dating famous men, living the dream that millions of people envied. And then she met Rainier. The meeting happened during the Cannes Film Festival in May 1955. Grace was in France promoting To Catch a Thief, which was actually filmed partly in Monaco. A photo opportunity was arranged. American movie star meets European prince. It was supposed to be a quick publicity event, but according to both of them, something clicked. They started corresponding, writing letters back and forth. Rainier visited Grace in the United States that December. On their 3rd day together, he proposed. She said yes. Now, here's where the fairy tale gets complicated. By reality, Grace's father, Jack Kelly, a self-made millionaire who'd built a construction empire, was concerned. His daughter was giving up a brilliant career to marry a prince of a country smaller than Central Park. So he did what any practical businessman would do. He negotiated a dowry, $2 million. Jack Kelly essentially paid $2 million for his daughter to marry Prince Rainier. Now, this sounds mercenary, but it made sense from both sides. Monaco needed the money. Grace's family wanted to ensure she'd be financially secure. And honestly, royal marriages had involved dowries for centuries. This was just a modern, very American version of an ancient tradition. The wedding itself was extraordinary. There were actually two ceremonies, a civil ceremony on April 18, 1956, and the religious ceremony the next day in St. Nicholas Cathedral. The cathedral ceremony was attended by over 600 guests, including Hollywood stars, European aristocracy, and political dignitaries. But more importantly, it was broadcast on television to an estimated 30 million viewers worldwide. This was unprecedented. Royal weddings had never been media events on this scale before. Grace Kelly's wedding basically invented the modern televised royal wedding spectacle. When Prince Charles married Diana in 1981, when William married Catherine in 2011, they were following the template that Grace and Rainier established. Grace's dress became one of the most iconic wedding dresses in history. It was designed by Helen Rose, who designed costumes for Grace's films at MGM. The bodice was made of rose point lace that was over a century old. The skirt was silk taffeta. The whole thing took 36 seamstresses 6 weeks to create. Decades later, when Catherine Middleton married Prince William, elements of her dress were inspired by Grace Kelly's. That's the lasting influence we're talking about. But after the cameras stopped rolling, after the fairy tale wedding was over, Grace had to actually live her new life, and it wasn't easy. She had given up her career completely. Her contract with MGM was terminated. She couldn't make movies anymore, couldn't act, couldn't do the work she loved and was brilliant at. She was now Princess Grace, and her job was being a princess, attending state functions, supporting charities, looking elegant, producing heirs. The culture shock must have been enormous. Grace had grown up in Philadelphia, worked in New York and Hollywood, been surrounded by creative, dynamic people, had control over her career and her life. Now she was in a tiny country where everyone spoke French, which she had to learn, where royal protocol dictated every aspect of her behavior, where her every move was scrutinized by the Monegasque people and the international press. The palace was beautiful but also somewhat uncomfortable and old-fashioned. Grace had to navigate complex relationships with Rainier's family, particularly his strong-willed mother and sister, who weren't always welcoming to the American actress who'd married into their family. But Grace did something remarkable. She embraced her role completely and made it her own. She had 3 children with Rainier, Princess Caroline in 1957, Prince Albert in 1958, and Princess Stephanie in 1965. This secured the succession and Monaco's independence. She threw herself into charity work, particularly supporting arts and culture in Monaco. She established the Princess Grace Foundation, which supported local artisans. She organized cultural events, brought international attention to Monaco through her continued celebrity, and basically became the best ambassador the principality could have hoped for. Grace's star power transformed Monaco. Because she was there, wealthy Americans and international celebrities wanted to visit. Tourism increased dramatically. The casino, which had been struggling, became profitable again. Real estate values soared. Monaco became synonymous with glamour, wealth, and sophistication. Grace hadn't just married a prince, she'd saved a country economically and given it an identity that would sustain it for decades. But it came at a personal cost. Grace missed acting. She missed the creative work, the challenge of performing, the satisfaction of doing what she was best at. There were occasional reports that she was unhappy, that she felt trapped, that she longed for her old life. In interviews, she was always diplomatic, saying she'd made the right choice, that she loved her family and her new country. But friends suggested that she struggled with the transition, that giving up her career had been harder than she had anticipated. In 1982, tragedy struck. Grace was driving with her daughter Stephanie from the family's country home back to Monaco when she apparently suffered a stroke. The car went off the road and crashed down a mountainside. Stephanie survived with injuries. Grace died the next day from her injuries. She 52 years old, the woman who'd become the embodiment of grace, elegance and fairy tale romance, died in a car accident on a winding Mediterranean road. The parallels to some of her movie roles, particularly To Catch a Thief with its dramatic scenes on those same coastal roads, were eerie and sad. Rainier never remarried. He lived another 23 years, dying in 2005 at age 81. By all accounts, he genuinely loved Grace, and her death devastated him. Their children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie, have had complicated lives in the public eye, dealing with their own scandals and tragedies, but they've maintained the Grimaldi dynasty. Prince Albert is the current ruler of Monaco, and the principality is more successful than ever, one of the wealthiest places per capita in the world. So what do we make of Grace and Rainier's story? Is it a fairy tale? Yes, in many ways. A beautiful actress marries a handsome prince. They have 3 children. They save a country they live in a palace by the Mediterranean. It's the stuff of storybooks. But it's also a story about sacrifice. Grace gave up the career she loved for duty, family, and a kind of life she'd never anticipated. She made that choice consciously, and by all accounts she honored that choice even when it was difficult. That takes strength and character that fairy tales usually don't explore. It's also a story about pragmatism, the $2 million dowry, the calculation that Grace's celebrity would benefit Monaco economically, the television broadcast of the wedding that served both as romantic spectacle and brilliant marketing. These weren't accidents. This was a marriage that worked on multiple levels: personal, political, and economic. That doesn't make it less genuine, but it does make it more complicated than the simple fairy tale narrative. And it's a story about transformation. Grace transformed from actress to princess. Monaco transformed from struggling principality to international symbol of wealth and glamour. And royal marriages themselves transformed from private political arrangements to public media spectacles. Grace and Rainier's wedding was watched by 30 million people in 1956. By 2011, when William and Catherine married, 2 billion people watched worldwide. Grace Kelly didn't just become a princess, she changed how the world thinks about royal marriages and modern monarchy. As you finally let sleep take you, think about Grace at 26, at the absolute peak of her career, making the decision to give it all up for a life she could barely imagine. Think about Rainier inheriting a struggling country, needing to find not just a wife, but someone who could help save Monaco, and finding Grace. Think about how their marriage combined genuine affection with practical necessity, fairy tale romance with hard-headed economics, Hollywood glamour with royal duty. And as your breathing slows and your mind drifts into dreams, let's reflect on this entire journey we've taken together tonight. We've traveled through nearly 1,000 years of history across every continent, through a dozen marriages that changed the world. We've seen marriages create nations and destroy them. We've seen marriages used as political weapons, as tools of diplomacy, as desperate attempts at survival. We've seen love and obsession, calculation and sacrifice, triumph and tragedy. We started with Ferdinand and Isabella creating Spain through a secret wedding and forged documents. We watched the Habsburgs destroy themselves through inbreeding. We felt Marie Antoinette's terror as she lost everything because a political marriage couldn't save France from revolution. We traced Queen Victoria's genetic legacy, spreading haemophilia through European royalty and contributing to the fall of the Romanovs. We saw Henry VIII break a church because he wanted a divorce. We traveled with Sophia Paleologena as she brought Byzantine civilization to Russia. We sailed through storms with James and Anne, creating the United Kingdom. We witnessed Joanna of Naples using marriage as a survival tool through 40 years of political chaos. We mourned with Shah Jahan as he built the Taj Mahal for his lost love. We admired Eleanor of Aquitaine's refusal to be controlled by anyone. We stood with Constantine XI as his failed marriage negotiations symbolized Byzantium's isolation. And we ended with Grace Kelly, proving that modern fairy tales can be real even if they're more complicated than we imagine. What ties all these stories together? It's this: marriage throughout history has never been just about two people. Royal marriages were tools of statecraft, vehicles for alliance, methods of legitimization, ways of transferring power and wealth and territory. The personal feelings of the people involved, whether they loved each other, whether they were happy, that was often secondary to the political purposes the marriage served. And yet, through all of that calculation and pragmatism, real human emotions existed. Real love, real grief, real ambition, real suffering. These weren't just chess pieces on a board. They were people, flawed, complex, trying to navigate impossible situations, sometimes succeeding brilliantly and sometimes failing catastrophically. Their marriages shaped the world we live in today, the countries we live in, the religions we practice, the languages we speak, the cultures we inherit. All of it traces back in part to marriages like the ones we've explored tonight. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey through history's most consequential marriages. I hope you found it fascinating, thought-provoking, maybe even a little bit romantic despite all the political machinations and occasional murders. These are the stories that remind us that history isn't just dates and battles and treaties. It's people making choices, living lives, loving and losing, succeeding and failing just like we do. Sleep well tonight, and may dreams be filled with palaces and empires, with love stories that span centuries, with the drama and beauty and tragedy of lives lived on history's grand stage. And when you wake up, remember that the choices we make in our own lives, who we love, who we commit to, how we honor those commitments, they might not reshape empires, but they shape us and the people around us. And that's its own kind of history. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.